I guess we can start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this tutorial on data and model-centric approaches for expansion of large language models to new languages. It's a bit of a mouthful. We have a bunch of interesting presenters here today, and I'll shortly introduce you all. That's me. I'm Safi. I'm a PhD student in the Wadhwani School of Data Science and AI in IIT Madras. And alongside me, I have Thanmay, who's a master's student in the same school. Joining us remotely is Anoop, who's a principal scientist in Microsoft Speech India. We also have Raj, who's an adjunct faculty at IIT Madras, and we have Rudra, who's a research scientist at IBM Research. This is the broad outline. So just a brief intro, since we are going to be covering the entire LLM training pipeline. So there's going to be a lot of content that will be covered. So we'll have to keep things quick and short. So we'll be covering, we'll be doing a breadth first approach, wherein we'll give you a lay of the land of the entire ecosystem. And then we'll leave you with a bunch of reference materials that you can just go back and look up. And so this is the broad agenda. We'll start off with a brief introduction by Anoop, who will be discussing the problem and trying to set tone. And then we'll look at the different steps in the pipeline. We'll look at vocabulary expansion first, and then continued pre-training. And then we'll take a short break of about 20 minutes, if possible. And then after the break, we'll look at post-training and evaluation. And finally, we'll end up with a bunch of future research questions that are possible so that you all have something to think about. And all the papers that are referred in the slides can be found in this reading list. The slides as well as the reading list will be up on our website soon. So you can just go back and have a look at it. With that, I'll hand it over to Anoop. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, Safi.
Great. Yeah. So over to you.
Hey, thank you. And welcome everyone to this tutorial on multilingual language expansion for LLMs. So as Safi said, first we will go over a brief introduction to LLMs. This is a topic, of course, everyone is familiar with, but just to sort of set some context and motivate the multilingual LLM challenge. Mm. So, what are large language models? As everybody already knows, today these are typically transformer decoder models, which means these are autoregressive models which generate one token at a time, the output. The key thing is that these models are trained on a self-supervised task, which is the next word prediction task. And these are trained on humongous amounts of text data, and the best models are extremely large models. So a combination of this simple next word prediction task along with training a lot of data and large models together uh, gives us these rapid advances in the world of large language models in the past few years because these kind of imbibe the models with wonderful, interesting capabilities. One important among them being in context learning abilities, where the model has learned a lot of knowledge. It's rich in knowledge uh, and has an understanding of what different tasks are. And with instructions and a few examples, the model is able to kind of solve a new instance of a task to some extent. And this can be further improved by fine tuning the models on instruction tuning tasks as well as aligning it to uh, human values and instructions, right? So all this taken together, we have seen rapid advances in LLMs. So next, what is so different about the current generation of LLMs compared to the older generation, the first wave of pre-trained models, which were BERT, BART, XLMR, and these kind of models, right? So the current generation is are decoder-only models, which can do both natural language understanding tasks and natural language generation tasks, whereas in the earlier generation, there was mostly a clear distinction in how the models were used. Encoder only models for NLU and encoder decoder models for NLG for the most part. We today use causal LM or next word prediction as the central objective, whereas we had denoising objectives like mass language modeling or denoising autoencoder earlier. And what this leads to is uh, in current LLMs, every task is essentially just task text completion. So you have a prompt, and then you ask the model to complete it. And every task can be kind of framed that way. Whereas earlier you would have a classification head if you want to do classification, uh, or you might put model the problem as sequence labeling problem or text generation problem. These were distinct things. Uh, Finally, these today's models are multitask models. They have already learned a lot via in context learning and post training, whereas earlier you would do per task fine tuning. So these 2 points kind of distinguish the current generation of LLMs from the previous ones, and this is also coupled with the fact that today's LLMs are much larger than the older generation of models. Now we have GPT-3 itself has 175 billion parameters, and the frontier models are today way bigger than that. They're trained on a lot of corpora. Qwen3, for example, was trained on 36 trillion tokens, whereas the BERT models were trained on 137 billion tokens. There are some explorations recently to revive BERT and do modern BERT, which is trained on uh, a few trillion tokens, but that's kind of an exception. Okay, so with that, let's move on. And with all these advances, LLMs have become very exciting. It has kind of transformed the field of NLP. And what we have got is they can do a lot of things because of their inherent knowledge, and they have multitask abilities, task composition abilities, just by prompting and specifying the instructions. Very little task specific training is mostly required unless it's a complex domain, and they can tackle a wide variety of tasks like reading, creative tasks, brainstorming, data generation, explanation, and the latest LLMs are also now uh, doing well on reasoning tasks, are able to break down complex tasks into step by step executions and be able to handle much more complex problems. So, with all that, uh, this is kind of sampled again of the kind of very interesting and complex tasks that LLMs can do. They can do math, they can do uh, drawings, they can plot stuff. You can ask the models to explain code, explain musical notations, understand programs, write programs, do complex problems, reason through them step by step, and solve these problems. Right? So these are all very rich capabilities that these LLMs today possess. Uh, but uh, Next slide, please. But yeah, and there is an explosion of LLMs, so both proprietary and open source models are also fairly strong. However, most of these gains are limited to English. So, what will it take for us to kind of make these LLMs work well for languages other than English for the vast majority of languages in the world? Next slide, please. Just to give you a idea of how LLMs compare for English versus other languages, here is a sampling of results on various kinds of tasks, ranging from simple ones like XNLI to translation to reasoning tasks like MMath. And across all this, you'll find that there is a fairly good gap between English and other languages. And typically, the uh, languages uh, which are fairly high resource, and the ones which are using Latin script tend to still do better on uh, compared to the other languages. So many low resource languages which have very little corpora uh, perform poorly, especially languages which are very different from English and don't use the Latin script. They are not that great. And if you look at open source models versus GPT and some of the proprietary uh, models like Gemini and all, you would find that there is a big gap. The open source models are still very interesting. There are a few models now that are increasingly becoming multilingual, but there is a long way to go. Uh, so now the next natural question is, okay, why do these LLMs lag behind for other languages? And uh, there are a few well-known reasons. So one is, of course, the lack of data, first pre-training data. The amount of text data in English is humongous. It far outstrips data in any other languages. So you can see the data size in Wikipedia. That itself is an illustration of the general representation on the web. And so it naturally, most of the knowledge in the world is captured in English documents as opposed to other languages, and most low resource languages have very, very little data. Even the training mixture of modern LLMs would typically have very little English data. By some accounts, less than 10, but maybe more, but not a lot more. So second is token representation. When the vocabulary is designed, there is very little vocabulary assigned to a lot of languages, which results in inferior representations. When it comes to instruction tuning, human preference data, reasoning data, the amount of data available in languages beyond English is very little. Uh, and so these are all challenges presented by the lack of data. There have been efforts in the community to look at multilingual methods to be able to transfer knowledge from English to other languages, capabilities from English to other languages. But there is a limit to what is possible with today's methods. Uh, and of course, a simple solution is to do translate test. That is, you can always use an English LLM as a backbone and then translate the query to English, process in English, give back the output after translation. This, of course, has limitations with the quality of the MT models and the overhead in multiple MT calls. So overall, there is still a way to go. So how do we then we address these questions? So one way, of course, is to sort of make the models multilingual uh, when you train them and to give increasing focus to that. So that's one direction. It has its challenges, has a lot of, you need a lot of compute and a lot of planning, and changes are not easy at different points. Uh, so what we look at in this tutorial is a kind of orthogonal approach, or a different approach, where we see that, okay, there are a lot of English models already available, which are very strong. So can we extend these LLMs to new languages? This can be more compute efficient, and this can leverage the strong capabilities of these models in English. And if we can do good transfer to other languages, we can improve. Also, the way the language models are evolving, uh, there are model releases happening all the time. So if we are look at efficient ways to adapt English LLMs, we can bring those advances to other languages fairly fast, as opposed to waiting for a new multilingual model to be trained again. So in that context, there are a bunch of projects which are trying to extend this, and there is a listing of these, and we will talk about examples from some of these projects through the course of this tutorial. Uh, so now the question is, okay, if you want to extend English LLMs, so do these English dominant LLMs already have some inherent multilingual capabilities? So yes, to some extent. And why do they have it? Maybe because they have seen some non-English data during training. They would have been exposed to documents which might have been in multiple languages, and so some data from other languages crept in. Incorrect LID could have resulted in some data from other languages creeping in. And also today, increasingly, many of the models, both proprietary and open source models, are already uh, having some increased representation for our non-English data. So even if there isn't a large effort to train multilingually, but at least there is some effort to cover a lot of languages. So that already gives some baseline and some multilingual capabilities to these models. So how good are these multilingual capabilities? It varies. The capabilities might be okay and good for language understanding, not so great for generation. Again, like Latin script languages generally tend to do better, and if the languages are better represented in the pre-training data, they would do better. But it will vary on a case-by-case basis. Uh, so, what is the nature of this uh, share this cross-lingual or multilingual capabilities that these English LLMs have? So how are they able to uh, uh, kind of respond, address tasks in non-English languages with a fair degree of quality. So is it that the models think in English, or they use English as a pivot for decision making, to put the same question another way? So there have been some studies to look at the internal representations of uh, the models at different levels while they are processing a query. Uh, and it seems like generally the bottom layers are concerned with feature learning, and they are kind of language agnostic. The middle layers start mapping from the features and concepts to language tokens. But there is a clear bias in English. If you look at the logits at the middle layers, it is very likely that the logits would be in English, which means the kind of tasks are being solved in English. Whereas the top layers, since they have to generate output tokens in a target language, they tend to start showing up tokens in the target language, the output language. And again, like studies have identified language specific neurons mainly concentrated at the bottom and top layers because that's where language specific things are happening. And so, the central question that we want to do in multilingual LLMs and for extending LLMs is to see how we can bring English representation and representations of other languages at different layers closer to each other, so as to achieve uh, good cross-lingual transfers. That is a central question that the field in general looks at. Now, uh, now let's get started with how to tackle the question that we are taking up today, which is extending English LLMs to uh, non-English languages. And this is kind of a canonical pipeline of how we would go about it. And then we'll delve into each of these boxes throughout this tutorial. So we start with an English LLM, and if the vocabulary of the LLM is not sufficient for the target language, then we would have a vocabulary expansion step, uh, which means the tokenizer would be modified, the embeddings would be modified, uh, followed by uh, continued pre-training. So this is needed so that the language modeling and language competence in the target languages achieved knowledge from data in the target language is obtained. This will give you a base LLM in the target language. And after this are post-training steps, which would include supervised instruction tuning, human preference data alignment, infusing reasoning capabilities, all in the target language. And at the end of this process, you would have a LLM which has been extended from English to the language of interest. So now let's delve into each of these areas. So we'll first start with vocabulary expansion. And so just to get some basic terminology. Uh, so what LLMs work with a finite set of basic input-output units. This is a set of tokens, and that constitutes the vocabulary of the LLM. So now the LLM has a tokenizer. The tokenizer is responsible for taking a stream of text and converting it into a stream of tokens. Each token has associated with it an embedding. So these embeddings are essentially capturing uh, context independent uh, similarities between the tokens. Okay. So what characterizes the LLM vocabulary? So generally we work with finite vocabularies and subword vocabularies, which means the basic units are smaller than words, and every word can be expressed as a composition or a concatenation of subwords. And this allows us to achieve an open vocabulary. So any new word can be represented as a concatenation of any of the existing subwords in the vocabulary. The what is the challenge when it comes to uh, multilingual LLM tokenizers? So what happens if the vocabulary is not well represented? So this is an illustration of what can happen. This is a Hindi sentence tokenized with LLM. Uh, and you can see that in this case, the tokenizer almost breaks down the sentence into characters and sometimes even bytes. Okay, so what this means is that there are a lot of tokens for their sentence, And this is typically captured by a metric called fertility. So fertility means the average number of tokens per word. So if the fertility is very high, it means that there is a lot of fragmentation happening, which is not desirable. And what happens? I mean, different scenarios. So maybe there are some unknown characters which are not there in the English or the English LLM vocabulary that you're working with. So these would be mapped to unknown vocabulary items in case of BPE based vocabs, or you might, yeah, or it might reduce to single characters if single characters exist. That will result in very high fertility. If you are using a byte-based vocabulary, then uh, it will result in even higher fertility because you would fall back to bytes uh, based on the Unicode decomposition of UTF-8 decomposition of the characters. So, what are the implications of high fertility? So, as you can imagine, I mean, these single characters they have very little semantics. So, the embeddings are very noisy, very less semantic cohesion. It's difficult to say what distributional representation such single embeddings for single characters are even capturing. On the this, in addition to that, the memory consumption is higher because the number of tokens are higher. So for a single sequence, you have a lot of uh, embeddings as well. And during inference time, the KV cache size can increase. Decoding time is also more because you have to generate a lot more tokens for the same information content compared to a language with lower fertility. Now, all language models have some limit on the maximum context length, and you can pack in limited information in the maximum context length if the fertility is very high. So we need to address this high fertility issue in order to make our tokenizers efficient and be able to represent the languages effectively. So how do we do that? So what we will do is to extend the uh, uh, tokenizer by adding more vocabulary items, or in some cases, even replace the vocabulary entirely. That's also a possibility. We'll talk about extending vocab. The case of replacement is very similar. Uh, so uh, we'll first train a tokenizer with the new vocabulary items using standard tokenizer training algorithms like BBE or Unigram algorithms, and add the new vocabulary items to the vocabulary, resulting in an extended vocab. Now, for the new vocabulary items, we need to initialize the embeddings, and we have embeddings both on the input and output side. And these might be separate if the embeddings are not tied. Uh, so once we have an LLM with extended vocab and initialized embeddings, these embeddings are not really in sync with the rest of the networks. So some amount of pre-training has to be done so that the model embeddings and the new embeddings and the rest of the model parameters are synchronized. So that's the overall workflow. So what do we expect from a good vocabulary expansion technique? One, of course, improved fertility so that you achieve efficient inference. Now, the whole process of vocabulary expansion will need some amount of continued pre-training, and we would want to optimize the amount of compute required and the amount of data required for continued pre-training. As far as performance on downstream tasks goes, we would want to, first of all, retain performance in the original languages in the LLM prior to expansion. Typically, English is what you would be interested in most cases. Second, how do you improve performance on the language of interest, of course? And can this technique achieve performance close to, suppose, if you had been able to train a multilingual model with English and the new language from scratch? So, would you be able to achieve that level of performance? And also, uh, can we achieve better cross-lingual transfer by bringing the embeddings and the rest of the model parameters in the representation space such that uh, transfer between English and other languages is enabled. Okay. So let's look at first a bunch of techniques for initializing the embeddings of the new tokens. Of course, some very simple methods which are good to try first are just to randomly initialize all embeddings, or in that's one way to do it. The other way is okay. You can just copy over the embeddings from the original vocab to the new vocab items via just some random assignment. Um, Another initialization, at least partial initialization, is at least for the shared vocabulary items, you can just copy over the vocabulary items from the old tokenizer to the new tokenizer. Now, this is too simple and it has a set of problems. This will change the vocabulary's probability distribution, and the generation in even the existing languages would be incorrect. Moreover, when you do continued pre-training, the convergence time typically tends to be very large because you've perturbed the uh, distribution of the embeddings a lot. So an improvement over this is average or mean initialization. The idea here is simple. Uh, the embedding of the new token is simply the mean of the embeddings of the existing tokens. This initialization has some good properties. So this achieves very low KL divergence between the pre and post expansion LMs for the existing vocabulary, which means that if you do, say, greedy decoding with a prompt which comprises only the older tokens, then the output will be the same as pre-expansion. Uh, so that's a good property. And in fact, this result can be generalized. It can be theoretically shown that as long as the new embeddings are in the convex hull of the existing embeddings, then these properties of low KL divergence and uh, the greedy decoding uh, performing as earlier uh, are maintained. Okay. Now, there are a couple of variants of this technique. I mean, we can initialize all the embeddings to same value, but maybe it's better to have some variation. So, one is you could add a small random noise to the average embeddings for every token. Secondly, okay, instead of averaging across all the embeddings, a simple variant is uh, so every new token can be tokenized using the existing tokenizer, and then its embedding is simply the average of the its constituent vocab items from the old tokenizer. So that's one way of initializing the new tokens. And averaging is a strong baseline and a good thing to start exploring if you are doing vocabulary expansion. Okay, now a variant of this is to do weighted average initialization, which is when you do this combination of uh, old tokens. Don't give all the tokens equal weight, but give them different weights. Now, what is the basis for assigning different weights to different source token embeddings? So it's based on the similarity between the source tokens and the target tokens. And there are a bunch of methods here. All of them rely on some sort of auxiliary static embeddings, word embeddings, word-to-vec style embeddings to get these similarity values. Uh, so I'll just mention a few of the prominent ones. So one way to do it is okay. Uh, so your new token uh, uh, is some sort of subword, and so if you have subword aware embeddings like fast text, so fast text has embeddings for n-grams. Now using n-gram embeddings, you can construct subword aware. You can construct embeddings for the new token in this auxiliary embedding space, and uh, since you are going to construct a multilingual word embedding space, a similarity in that space can be considered to be the similarity between the tokens, and that can be used as weight to sort of do a weighted average initialization of your embeddings. So that's subword aware embeddings. You can also use word embeddings as is. In this case, for a given token, its sort of weight is uh, the weight of its what do you say average of all the word embeddings that contribute to which this subword contributes. Or you can just directly train subword embeddings just as you would train word-to-vec embeddings. These are different ways of doing these initializations. What you achieve through these weighted average initialization methods is that you see that the initialization is better, which means that after when you do continued pre-training, these methods converge faster than random baselines on both language model perplexity and downstream performance. You still need continued pre-training. Initialization is not sufficient, but they will converge much faster than other baselines. So there's some variants of this average initialization. So one particular case is one for all, where this is a case where you don't want to just extend to one language, but for multiple languages. Now that means that you would have to handle a large vocabulary. And so what this approach tries to do is factorize the embedding space into uh, two embedding matrix into two matrices. Uh, Two low rank matrices, and one of them is language dependent, the other is language independent. And now only the language independent for the language independent matrix, the embeddings have to be learned, and this can be learned in the same way as average initialization. And next slide, please. So far we looked at a bunch of heuristic approaches to learn these weights for the linear combination using cross-lingual embeddings, bilingual dictionaries, and they don't particularly optimize any specific objectives. But can we just learn these weight matrices for transformation of the embedding spaces directly? And if so, what should that learning objective be? Uh, So one approach is simple word-to-vec objective. So here, the idea is that can we learn how you can combine the word embeddings, the embeddings of the new tokens in terms of the embeddings of the existing tokens, and this can be posed as a word-to-vec problems with certain constraints. That is, the embeddings of the existing tokens are frozen, and the new tokens are strictly expressed as weights of existing tokens. So all you're learning is the weights. So this is very inexpensive because you can do word-to-word training pretty fast, and no bilingual embeddings will be required in this case. The other interesting approach is to directly optimize the objective you are interested in. So for the new language, you are actually interested in optimizing the language model objective. The, and so what you can do is uh, you can optimize for the language modeling objective, but update only the weight matrix for the embedding transformation. Every other parameter in the LLM is frozen. Okay, and this can directly optimize for the task of interest, but it's more computationally expensive. And there are a few tricks to get that working. So we can see that these approaches which actually learn the weights outperform or at least are competitive one with the heuristic based approaches, but the approaches have simpler training pipelines, don't require other resources like word embeddings and bilingual dictionaries. Uh, so all the approaches we have seen so far, what they are trying to do is uh, just for the vocabulary, for the tokenizer of interest, we're trying to learn the initializations. But is it possible to sort of learn a function which, for a given fixed model, can predict embeddings for any tokenizer? So that's why it's sort of known as zero-shot tokenizer transfer. So once you learn the uh, function, you can predict embeddings for any tokenizer. And so that's why it's a hypernetwork. It's something that generates the embedding parameters for the model. So it's not a static lookup anymore. This hypernetwork generates the embedding parameters. How do we go about training such a hypernetwork? So first of all, of course, you would need diverse tokenizer data so that you can cover all sorts of tokenization. So we can sample frequent tokens from all substrings in from different subsets of data for the language. And we can sort of sample frequencies and add noise to frequencies, etc. We have diverse tokenizer data. Second, what is the training objective for training this hypernetwork? So we, of course, don't have any target embeddings. We don't know what the target embeddings should look like. And therefore, what we do is, just as we did in the previous approach, we will train the standard LM objective only, but you learn only the hypernetwork parameters. All other LM parameters are frozen. So this is again end-to-end training. But the goal here being we want to learn the hypernetwork which will generate the embeddings for the tokenizer. And the hypernetwork will look something like this. So it takes in uh, the new tokenizer, right? and the tokens in the new tokenizer are broken down into its constant units using the old tokenizer. And then these tokens are passed to a small encoder language model, uh, which uh, which will generate the actual embeddings. Okay. And now, so this is the network that is being optimized during the LM training process, and we sort of make this training process more stable by making sure that first we learn to mimic the embeddings of the initial tokenizer, and then later we try to make sure that for these uh, initial tokens, original tokens, the uh, embeddings don't change much during the trading process. So this approach works pretty well. On a lot of downstream tasks, it performs better than any of the approaches we have discussed, and we can do continual pre-training of less than a billion tokens to close the gap with the original model. An interesting thing is that if you have trained the hypernetwork for a base model, it can be applied to the to a fine-tuned model that was derived from the original base model. So this is good. You can do the hypernetwork training once for the base model and use the same for any of the fine-tuned models derived from the original base model. So let's now look at a few continued pre-training methods specifically for vocabulary expansion. How do you achieve effective vocabulary expansion? So the basic canonical method is this. So once you have initialize your uh, new tokens, what you can do is freeze the entire non-embedding parameters and then fine-tune only the embedding parameters during the uh, continued pre-training stage. So now the model is sort of at the end of that stage, aligned well. The embeddings for the new language are aligned well with the non-embedding parameters as well. There are a bunch of things you can do in addition to improve CPT. So we can use some language-specific positional embeddings, language-specific adapters, adding noise to embeddings. All these techniques sort of give different degrees of improvement depending upon the task, the embeddings, etc. So overall, we can see that using this recipe, the adapted model is competitive with any jointly trained model. Uh, English performance is not degraded. And the interesting thing to notice in this approach is that uh, we froze the non-embedding parameters during the adaptation process and just learned the new set of embeddings. Uh, and the model is now working for the new language. So it sort of shows that the internal representations that the model initially learned for English, the model it was initially trained on, uh, is pretty good for other languages as well, as long as you can adjust for uh, the vocabulary of new languages. Next slide, please. Uh, so now, along with this, I mean, you can do a few things to speed up convergence. So one is what data do you use for continued pre-training, and it is good to select data where there is a high coverage of the new tokens. It's good to first freeze the non-embedding parameters initially, as we just saw. And for the shared vocabulary items, having an additional objectives to make sure that they don't deviate much from the original embeddings helps a lot. Uh, Now, we saw that in many of these approaches, you're actually optimizing for the language model itself, language modeling objective itself, which is costly because you have to do a pass to the entire model. So it turns out that you can actually prune the LLM and use only a few layers during this stage of learning the new initializations, and that can actually speed up the process of CPT uh, uh, for vocabulary adaptation. Okay. Now, okay, so this is what you could do for vocabulary adaptation. But another question you can ask is, okay, when you do the initial pre-training for English, suppose English is the only language being trained for, or maybe a few languages, can we do something in the initial pre-training so that at some later point, if we decide to expand the vocabulary and add new languages, that process is simpler. The goal being, can you improve the plasticity of the new model to adapt to new embeddings, new parameters, and new languages? So one approach is to use a universal tokenizer. So when you train the initial model, the pre-trained model, we could have a universal tokenizer that covers most languages in script, even if they are not included in the initial pre-training. So what we can see is that if we do the pre-training in this way, uh, the 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 resultant tokenizer is actually much easier to adapt to new languages compared to even approaches like average initialization. This is probably because even though the new languages were not explicitly included in the pre-training, maybe some amount of data for these new tokens were seen during the pre-training. So there is some amount of initial pre-training that happens, and it's a good starting point because those embeddings are already kind of aligned to the other embeddings and the non-embedding parameters. Next, okay. Uh, so what are we doing during vocabulary initialization? We are adding a few embeddings or changing few embeddings. So sort of you're resetting the embeddings and changing them during the process of vocabulary adaptation. Now, during the initial pre-training, if you can teach the model that it is possible that the embeddings will be reset, then that can help the model to adapt quickly to new embeddings during continued pre-training. So what you do is periodically just reset the embeddings, and this sort of helps the network to avoid taking shortcuts and learning to quickly adapt whenever embeddings change. So this turns out to be pretty useful in terms of both the amount of corpus required for adaptation and the compute required for adaptation. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we covered a bunch of methods for vocabulary initialization, ranging from uh, sampling from random distributions, averaging methods, weighted averaging methods, and finally hypernet networks, which can generate embeddings for any tokenizer for a given network. Okay. So let's summarize what we saw to look at all the vocabulary expansion techniques and what are the recommendations in case we ever want to do vocabulary expansion. So what we could do is so one we can clearly see that vocabulary expansion helps reduce fertility, improve efficiency. Uh, can we do better than random initialization? Yes, weighted averaging and the methods for learning new embeddings tend to do better. Uh, Even averaging is a strong baseline. And with these methods, we can have faster convergence in a ballpark of a billion tokens. Will vocabulary expansion methods lead to lower performance on English? Uh, so as we saw, if the newly initialized embeddings are in the convex hull of existing embeddings, then uh, the grading decoding results don't change. English performance should not be impacted much. Of course, once you start doing some continual pre-training, there might be a drop, but these can be mitigated by the right representation of English in the data mixture, the CPT methods that we just saw, etc. Finally, the question is okay. Suppose I am willing to live with the suboptimal vocab with high fertility, but still fine tune on the suboptimal vocab. Uh, do I get better results with that? Maybe you do, right? Because that suboptimal vocab is still kind of well aligned to the network. Uh, so, so even vocabulary expansion methods can be competitive with if you just compare to just fine tuning the existing network, provided you do the right choice of embedding initialization, continued pre-training, etc. Finally, as we saw, it will make life much easier if we make provision for vocabulary expansion during the initial pre-training itself. Uh, so yeah, with that, we kind of conclude this part about very important part of how do we expand the vocabulary for a existing uh, uh, English dominant LLM to account for new vocab items for new languages. We'll just now next move on to the next part, which is continued pre-training, and I'll hand it over to Safi for this.
Yeah, we'll take a short pause here in case there are any questions from
Yeah.
anyone. Yeah, please.
So we haven't gotten to the instruction fine-tuning part yet, but this is a question about the vocabulary. Do we know how close the after instruction fine-tuning the embedding layer is to the original model? If they're almost the same, could we do continued pre-training on the base model and transfer the learned word representations to the instruction fine-tune model? Or in general, task-specific fine-tunes, how much do the word representations change?
So are you talking about vocabulary expansion directly at the instruction fine-tuning stage, or
Yeah, so
I mean
if
just
we do the, sorry, yes.
yeah, I mean, are you talking just about continual pre-training or vocabulary expansion as well?
So after we do the vocabulary expansion and then do
Mhm.
some, let's say, continued pre-training, and then we have some good word representations for the new words from the new
Yeah.
language. Would it be
Yes.
possible to just keep those exact representations and just plug them into an instruction fine-tune model? Because if we just do the continued pre-training on an instruction fine-tune model, then there's a mismatch on the task, right? But can we just, if we only fine-tune, for example, like you said, the embedding layer, and then can we just plug in those learned embeddings into the fine-tuned model,
Mm,
into the original fine-tuned model?
Okay. Uh, well, I mean, there were two parts to your question. So the first part were, do you see a change in the embedding layers from the base model to the fine-tuned model? So yeah, there are some studies which show that there is not much of a change, and that's why, like, I think one of the methods I mentioned was to sort of carry over the hyper-network embeddings from the base model to the fine-tuned model. So at least in that particular case, uh, they show that it works. So it might be a more general result, but there is some evidence to that.
Um, I had another question, but I forgot.
Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Junish from Kyoto University, and
Yeah.
I specifically work in Sanskrit computational linguistics. So when I use GPT models for Sanskrit or any other Indic language, I find that their generation and overall their performances is quite acceptable. So my question is like, if we adopt these methods like vocabulary expansion for specifically other languages, so what extra we can expect that these efforts, what kind of fruits we can expect from these efforts?
Uh, yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are two things here. I mean, adequate performance could be one in terms of uh, like doing well on a bunch of tasks, but uh, if you do a comprehensive evaluation, it might be the case that there are many other tasks where the models don't do well, and hence there is a case for still working on uh, adapting the language models for these tasks. Right? So yeah, there is a certain level of capability, but there is still a scope for expansion. And the second point, particularly with respect to vocabulary expansion, is even with the suboptimal vocabulary, you might get a decent performance in terms of downstream tasks, but the overhead of uh, token generation, increased inference time, increased memory because the tokenizer fertility is too high, I mean, that still needs to be addressed for practical scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
So if I understand correctly, if we build a new tokenizer during the vocabulary expansion that will include or represent the new language better, then we have to choose a new vocabulary or like a BPE vocabulary size. Do you have any insights on this hyperparameter and on how to choose it?
Mm, Well, typically, if you were doing an English only LLM, you would the vocab sizes are roughly in the 32K range, maybe sometimes 64K range. That seems to be good enough for a very high resource language. So a low resource language can probably do with much less, maybe 8K, 16K. And if you look at many of the tokenizers for the leading LLMs today, multilingual LLMs, in aggregate, they support 200K to 250K vocabulary items across all major languages and scripts. So yeah, that would be like my feeling that for many of the low resource languages, you wouldn't need 32K, much smaller. And since there will be some shared subwords, a total of 200 to 50K seem to be sufficient for most languages today. Of course, this is excluding many of the tail languages which would still have high fertility. This might just address maybe around the top 100 languages.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's continue to the next section now. It's about continued pre-training. So what has happened till now is that you've expanded your vocabulary, you've initialized your embeddings well, and so now you've given the ability of to your model to actually speak that language, but now it doesn't actually speak it. I mean, it doesn't know the language well. So you need to do some sort of continued pre-training, and this is the broad objective of continued pre-training, wherein you start off with a base LM for which the vocabulary has been expanded, the embeddings have been initialized. You have a bunch of monolingual data in that particular language, and then you just follow your regular causal language model objective, which is your next token prediction. And then in the end, you get a CPT model, which is a stronger base model as compared to the previous stage, and then you can use that for your post-training stage. So before actually going into the details about this, let's see why should we even do continued pre-training? What's the benefit that it offers? So first thing is that, of course, you want to teach the language to your model. So you want the language competency or fluency in that particular, in that particular target language. And so if you look at the table there, as you increase your data that you're showing during the continued pre-training stage, the perplexity starts reducing. Also, another benefit of this is that it is much more efficient than training from scratch. So if you look at the pink line that's in the plot there, that's the model that has been trained from scratch as compared to the blue line, which is a CPT model, a continually pre-trained model that has been initialized from English, and it achieves a lower loss for far less amount of compute. And another reason is that you want to improve the alignment between English and your target language. And as previously we've heard, a lot of knowledge is present in English. And if you're able to somehow crack this game of cross-lingual transfer, that will, basically result in your model performing better in your target language. And just a dummy example is that, okay, the cosine similarities between English and target languages, they increase as you continue pre-training. So yeah, this can be useful for transfer learning from English. Another important thing is that even after you try all of this continual pre-training, even after you try various techniques for cross-lingual transfer, there have been certain efforts which show that this still doesn't work that well. So for example, there's one of the tasks that you can try, that's knowledge probing task, wherein you create these facts. For example, Bloomberg was founded in New York. That's a singular fact. And you create these templates in various languages. X was founded in Y, that's in English. In Spanish, you have certain similar template. And then when you test it out, for English, it's successfully able to predict New York as the correct answer. But when you look at the Spanish task, it predicts 2012 as the token with the most confidence, at the first position, which by itself is also incorrect. The New York is present in the second position. So this shows that even after you do this sort of cross-lingual transfer, the model still performs much better in English as compared to other languages. And these results also kind of show the same picture, wherein if you look at the pink line, that's the language-specific models. And for English, that's simply quite high as compared to all the remaining languages. In fact, as you go down the line, the performance is hardly anything. So two important points that you can take from this. One thing is that there is not a lot of data, knowledge-rich data for other languages. So you need that. Second thing is that most models, multilingual models, they're not able to transfer the knowledge properly from English to other languages. Finally, you also want improved downstream performance because that's your ultimate aim. You want the model to perform well in your downstream tasks. So if you look at the plot here, the gray bar that is there, that's pre-training from scratch on English. The bar after it is a pre-training from scratch on French, English plus French. Whereas the bar after it, the final one, the highest one, That's a model that has been continually pre-trained on top of English, and that simply has the best performance as compared to other variants. So in some sense, you're able to retain the in-context capabilities of your original English model, and that is better than pre-training from scratch. So after establishing this foundation for the need of continual pre-training, let's look at what type of data should we do this continual pre-training on. And I've listed down some of the properties that you would want in your multilingual corpus. For example, you need a large-scale document-level data set. You want your LLMs to be long context models, so you need large document data sets. You need high-quality documents, of course. Adding noise is harmful for the model. You need a wide coverage of topics, as we've seen in the knowledge probing task. You need knowledge to be, you need all sorts of knowledge to be represented in multiple languages. You need representation of culture specific data, because if you are interacting with a model in a particular language, you would want the model to be culturally aware when it's giving you a response. And finally, you also want to capture data in different modalities and helpful cross-lingual transfer. I won't go into the last 2 points in detail because that's going to come shortly. Now, there are a bunch of existing corpora out there. You've got MC4, Wikipedia, Oscar, Cultura-X. Some of them satisfy these properties. Some of them, it's a bit questionable. So the best way is to go about and build language-specific data sets to address this gap. One of the famous efforts that is there is the FineWeb 2, released by Hugging Face. It's basically just scaling up the web data, whatever process they had followed for FineWeb, which was the English-specific corpus. They've replicated and they've slightly tweaked a few things for their multilingual corpus. So it covers a bunch of languages, over 1,000+ languages, Russian, Chinese, and these languages form the larger chunk of it. As compared to, and then there's a huge long tail of other languages. So the way they've processed it, they've taken about 100 common crawl snapshots. It's a very large amount of data, a very large amount of raw data. And then after doing some extensive cleaning, deduplication, they reached to about 20 TB of data. It has about 3 trillion words, which is, of course, peanuts as compared to what is there for English. But yeah, that's the largest effort that's out there. But web data is, again, independently may not be sufficient. And just to show this, this is the table of the data that is there in FineWeb for different languages. If you look at Russian, that's about I would say 600 billion words. And then as we come down the line, Hindi is just about 11 billion words. Bosnian is just about 9 billion words, which is hardly anything. So you need to explore additional sources of data. Web may not be the only way in which you could get data for these languages. And just as a small case study, this is one of the efforts that I was fortunate to be part of. It's called Indic LLM Suite, wherein we worked on this data called as Sangraha, which is creating a large pre-training data at scale for Indian languages. And if you see, web is still a large chunk of the data that comes in. But apart from web, we have PDFs and videos. So a lot of literature data, a lot of all the other language data is kind of locked in PDFs, books, a lot of them which have not even been digitized, and of course a lot of videos. So you need this good OCR models, good ASR models to kind of extract the text content out of it. Of course, given the trend of omni models, multimodal models, that data is again in some way indirectly coming in. But it would help if we can consider other different modalities of data for extracting this text data too. Right. So now I'll just briefly describe how cleaning of this web data can potentially happen. I'll just quickly rush over this because we are slightly short of time. So we start off with downloading these WARC files, which are basically web archive files that Common Crawl releases. And it's a large engineering effort because there are thousands of snapshots that are there, thousands of WARC files that are there, which are quite large. And you need some very efficient pipelines to process this. So yeah, as the data is coming from the web, it's quite noisy. You need to do some sort of filtering over it. And the basic filtering that you can do is just remove certain websites. And there are a lot of block lists that are out there. And any document that falls under that block list, you simply remove that. And then you have these HTML documents. You have to extract text from it. There are a bunch of frameworks that are out there. Traffilatura is one of the prominent ones. People also do maintain certain leaderboards of tracking which framework works best. But yeah, it's up to you. Then once you've extracted this text content, you need to do some sort of language identification on top of it. You need good LID models. Otherwise, it's going to be this noise that keeps coming in. You need models that are capable of distinguishing languages that follow the same script. You need models that are capable of identifying what script it is, because there are certain languages which are written in multiple scripts. So you need good language identification models. Then you do some sort of deduplication, wherein the intention is to remove the duplicate content that's present in the web. There are a bunch of works that have shown that deduplication is one of the most important stages in an LLM data cleaning pipeline. There are, again, a bunch of algorithms that you can try, min-hash being one of the prominent ones. Then we do some sort of stop word filtering. Two things that can be possible here. One thing is that you want to remove all the toxic data that's there in your model. So you create these toxic word lists, and any document that contains number of toxic words greater than a certain threshold, you simply discard that document. And another interesting thing is that you want your documents to contain certain stop words. And this is kind of counterintuitive to the standard NLP tasks, wherein we are being taught to remove stop words because they don't add any value. But the idea here is that stop words by themselves, even if they don't add too much meaning, too much value to the sentence or to the document, they are in some way a proxy for quality, because without having these adjectives, articles, and everything, you cannot create a good English sentence. So that's why you need your document to contain certain stop words, and that acts as a proxy for quality of a document. Then we do some sort of filtering, threshold-based filtering. You can compute various statistics. I'll show some statistics in the next slide. And then if certain documents falls under that threshold, you can accept that, or else you can simply reject it. And for low resource languages, since this pipeline is kind of it's very strict for low resource languages, you would want to do some sort of upsampling or precision filtering, wherein you kind of, so upsampling is basically sampling more of certain documents which are of high entropy, high quality. And precision filtering is basically if the low resource languages share a script with the high resource languages, you want that confusion to be minimized. I'll leave the details to be, in the Fine Web 2 paper, you can go ahead and read more about it. And that's the broader pipeline that was followed to create Fine Web 2. Right. So these are some of the thresholds that I've mentioned. You can compute certain statistics like word count, character count, mean line length, etc. Now, but one important thing to wonder here is, how do you define these thresholds? What thresholds do you want for your particular language? Do you want a common threshold, or do you want language-specific threshold? Common threshold may penalize certain languages more. For example, if a language is agglutinative in nature, then the word length is quite long as compared to other languages. And then, if you were to use language-specific thresholds, then you'll have to sit and go through all the statistics yourself, determine, okay, what could be the threshold that will work well, and it simply takes a lot of time. So there are certain interesting approaches that you can follow, wherein you have something called adaptive filtering thresholds, wherein there are certain heuristics like 10 tail, for example. That means removing the last tail of 10% of the data from your corpus. Quant, for example, means if a threshold for English had removed X% of the data, then you choose a threshold for your language that also removes X% of the data. And that's the idea behind, so using these heuristics, you can compute, you can choose your thresholds based on the performance for your language. Some of the challenges in this filtering that we've seen till now, some of the multilingual challenges. For example, this URL filtering that we had, can existing block lists cover all the multilingual content that is out there? Probably the answer is yes. I'm not sure right now. But yeah, this is something that has to be looked. Secondly, the stop word filtering. You need to curate language-specific words, both toxic words as well as stop word words. And you need good LID models, which are robust enough to handle your code mixed content, romanized content, and also capable of distinguishing similar languages. I'll quickly glance over some of the examples of the type of data that is typically removed. So for example, this is the type of document that could be removed by the symbol heavy filter in our cleaning pipeline. This is the document that is, this is the cleaning that will happen if you use something called as a terminal punctuation filter, wherein all the red lines that you see, which is basically noise, it's menu items and all the other things, which is basically removed from all of this. And since I've mentioned that you need to process multimodal content, you need to come up with specific multimodal filters. Wherein, for example, if your document has a lot of overlapping bounding boxes, you can simply filter it out, just discard it, because that's simply going to add a lot of noise in your data. Or if you have a horizontally sparse or a vertically sparse document, it's better to just remove all of them. I'll quickly go over usefulness of cleaning of data. The main thing to look for is the red line that is out there towards the rightmost. That is a combination of all the steps that we had. That gives you a better aggregate performance of over bunch of languages across the various benchmarks. Now, we had seen the filters that we have seen till now, they're mere heuristics. And we assume that those heuristics are kind of proxies for quality. That may not entirely be true. So is there anything better that we can do? Yes, you can use something like model-based filtering, wherein the idea here is that you train these small classifiers. It could either be small language models, it could either be simple fast text-based classifiers, or it could be n-gram language models, wherein you train these models on either annotated data or high quality data. And these models are responsible for predicting whether a certain document is actually of good quality or not. And this works quite well. There are certain trade-offs, of course. For example, if you use an LLM-based classifier, it's a lot more expensive to run. You would need to, if you have to process about 15 trillion tokens, then you need about 6,000 hours as compared to a fast text classifier, which simply finishes off in 1,000 hours. The performance also slightly varies from these two types of classifiers. For example, in Chinese, you see the pink line that is dominated. That's an LLM-based classifier, and that has much higher performance as compared to the fast text-based classifier. Whereas for German, both kind of have the same performance. So there's a trade-off between cost and performance, and you must decide it for your own language. This model-based filtering is also useful if you want to filter out certain domains of data. So for example, if you want your model to work well with STEM-like domains, legal or reasoning, these kind of things, then you can use similar model-based classifiers to filter out your data. And this was something similar done by FineWeb EDU, wherein if you look at the orange line that's there on the top, that's the data that has been filtered for these domains. And that simply reaches an incredible performance as compared to all the other as compared to the raw FineWeb data. So you observe significant downstream performance boosts as compared to the original FineWeb data by this sort of filtering. So I'll take a pause here. So we've seen how data has to be created. I'll hand over back to Anoop to continue with the remaining steps. We'll take the questions at the end of the continued pre-training stage. Anoop, over to you.
Yeah. Okay, we saw one important aspect of continued pre-training, which is data, and how do you curate high quality and diverse data. Once we have the data, how do we actually do the multilingual pre-training? What are the good practices there? So we'll quickly go over that. So what is a good recipe, right? And today, even when you're doing the initial pre-training, the pipeline is pretty complex. It's no longer about just taking a bunch of data and doing next word prediction, but it's an involved pipeline in itself with initial pre-training and then mid-training and cool down, etc. So we would imagine that we would have to do something similar even in the contingent pre-training case so that uh, we have a very strong uh, base LLM for the new language, which can serve as a basis for further post-training. So what do we want to do here, right? So one, of course, we do the initial continual pre-training with all the available data, and typically you want high quality document level data so that you can fine tune long coherent sequences and learn to correlate different pieces of information. We must ensure that there is a balanced distribution across all the languages we are interested in, if there are multiple languages we're dealing with. Uh, and after the initial CPT, the late stage CPT for towards the later ending stages of continued pre-training, we can try to sort of focus on certain subsets of data which are of interest. So typically, these would be like one, you would want to do some long context trainings to infuse the model with long context. There are certain domains that are of particular interest, STEM, math, etc. For most LLMs code. So how do you so you could fine tune on these kind of uh, targeted high quality data like FineWeb EDU that Safi just talked about, uh, and in general also prepare the ground for further post training by uh, training on reasoning centric data which has step by step breakup of how to uh, solve tasks, or instruction pre-training where you expose the model during this late stage pre-training to uh, instruction response pairs or chat like data. So all these are kind of to uh, further improve the model towards building better post-trained models. And this also includes like typically a annealing or a cool down stage where you finally fine tune with a high quality subset and lower the learning rate down to zero. And the goal of this final thing is to get a final strong base model which is in a low loss region, and it's has been trained stably to be in that region. Uh, we must also particularly pay attention to the learning rates and schedules for continual pre-training. So typically, you would start off the initial learning rate for CPT at a lower value than what was the initial learning rate for the initial pre-training. And for the annealing and cool down, again, we need to take care of that as we just talked about. So comprehensively, these are the things we need to take care of to sort of build out a good uh, continued pre-training pipeline for uh, the new language. Now let's go to some specific questions that are of interest. Now, when we do continued pre-training on the new language, does English performance get impacted? So the answer is yes, and definitely if you pre-train only on uh, the new language, then it will lead to some catastrophic performance and degrade English performance in terms of perplexity, the raw LM capability, as well as on different linguistic and NLP tasks and knowledge tasks. So across the board, English performance will decrease. The next question is, okay, is it important to retain English capabilities and competence? Well, if you want to the model to support English as well as the new language, then of course. But is English is retaining English performance also important to improving performance for the new language? So that's an interesting question. And yeah. So here we can see that if English performance drops, then there is a performance drop in other languages too, the other language that you're fine tuning for when it comes to downstream tasks. When it comes to your language modeling quality as captured by perplexity, uh, in that case, the new language still does well because you're fine tuning for that particular language, but downstream tasks certainly suffer. And therefore, it is important that we retain English performance. Uh, so why does this happen? What happens if the CPT continued pre-training does not include English? So a couple of things. One, there is a strong parameter shift without English. So if you pre-train only on the new language, there is the model parameters change a lot as measured by the L2 norm across all the parameters, as you see on the plot on the right side. Second, if you look at the even the distribution of vocabulary, there is a major change when you fine tune without English. Uh, and in particular, in the plot on the left, this is a case of looking at the distribution of, uh, uh, in the case of multiple choice questions, the distribution, probability distributions for each choice. And in the case where you you fine tune only on the new language, the perplexity is much higher, and the models cannot distinguish between correct and incorrect answers. Whereas if you include English in the mix, the perplexities are lower. So this kind of shows what happens. There is an initial uh, period where the distribution shifts rapidly, and that's not a good thing. So how can we mitigate this? Okay. So one thing is, okay, clearly there is a big change in parameters, which is not desirable. So an obvious thing is to look at LoRa or other parameter efficient methods, which can be used to reduce catastrophic forgetting. Is that useful? Yes. So that can help reduce the perplexity and give improved performance uh, for the non-English languages compared to no English CPT. But it still kind of lags behind an approach where you do CPT on both the English and the non-English language. This is primarily because LoRa methods are constrained in the capacity that they have, and the more CPT data you want to utilize, the less effective LoRa would be. Okay, so then if you have to do full fine tuning, what is a solution to avoiding catastrophic forgetting? So the simplest solution is data replay. So when you do continual pre-training, also add English to the mix. And throughout the training process, keep English in the training mix. That is full replay. And typically, 20 to 30% English data is sufficient to avoid catastrophic forgetting. But that is still an overhead. You are wasting about 20 to 30% compute simply to avoid catastrophic forgetting. So, can we improve upon that? So, one solution is to do something called curriculum replay, where English is used only during the initial part of the continual pre training. And then after that, you can switch over to completely doing pre training on the new language. And it can be seen from uh, results that data replay surely helps improve performance in all aspects. So the effects of catastrophic forgetting are mitigated. Curriculum-based CPT can be as effective as full CPT, but you can also achieve significant savings in compute. Data replay also helps you regain English performance, which is what we wanted to do. Uh, so can we do sort of even better? I mean, not even take a little bit of overhead on continual pre-training. So one class of interesting methods is to look at model merging. So the idea being that, okay, so you have the initial base checkpoint, and then you do continual pre-training for a while on the new language and end up with the new checkpoint. Now, can we combine these two checkpoints such that the combined model uh, has both capabilities in the new language as well as preserves English performance. So model merging is well studied. There are different techniques ranging from simple averaging of the uh, parameters to being more smart and deciding which parameters should be merged, which should not be, etc. And one thing in particular, one approach in particular, which I'll just talk about, is exponential moving average, where you're not just taking the original pre-trained checkpoint and the final continued checkpoint, but instead of that, as you are doing the continual pre-training, we compute new checkpoints as a exponential moving average of the checkpoint. So you always combine after a few steps the current checkpoint with the previous saved checkpoint. And the previous checkpoints are given a higher weight so that the models don't drift too much away from the initial point. And this kind of exponential moving averaging is very competitive with full or curriculum based continued pre-training without any overhead of extra 20% uh, training. And since we have the topic of model merging, I'll digress a little bit just to point out that model merging is in general a useful tool for language adaptation when you're looking for something for efficient adaptation. And I'll take one particular case of that where you have a pre-trained model, uh, and how do you now come up with a instruction tune model for a new language? So the typical way, as we have discussed initially, the pipeline is to sort of do continual pre-training on the new language, followed by instruction fine-tuning or supervised fine-tuning on the new language. That's one way to do that. But an alternative could be, okay, I might already have a very strong SFT for English based on the base model. And now I can also have a continually pre-trained model for the new language. So can I combine the language skills of the new pre-trained model and the instruction following capabilities from the existing check? Right? And again, model merging can be used here to combine these two checkpoints, the continually pre-trained uh, checkpoint for the new language and the SFT checkpoint. And this we can see that yields can yield in most cases better results than the standard CPT followed by SFT pipeline for the new language. So just wanted to point out that model merging is interesting, and this was one interesting use case for the same. Now, if you had to expand to a large number of languages, most of the CPT cases we just discussed were about adding one more language. But if you had to extend to a large number of language, then what is a good recipe for that? And turns out like one way of doing that well is to combine full and LoRa-based continual pre-training. So what you do is first do a full fine-tuning of all parameters for all the languages. And then you could have language group specific LoRa modules. And in the second round, you would just fine tune the LoRa adapters for those particular languages in that group as the data streams in during fine tuning. So this recipe turns out to be good for extending the model to a large number of languages because you have some language group specific parameters, which sort of maybe one of the reasons it improves is there is an increased capacity. The LoRa parameters used in this work is fairly substantial, adding about 15% more parameters. So, uh, yeah, that sort of helps improve and support up to 50 languages. Let's now come to an important question. Like as you talked throughout, one of the important things we want to always do is do good cross-lingual transfer during every stage of language expansion. So during the during the pre-training stage, what can we do and why is it important? So of course, cross-lingual alignment can help cross-lingual transfer. Plus, we want to make knowledge available in English to other languages. And in particular, I would want to call out that we would want to improve the translation task, which is an important task in a multilingual setup. So, and we can do a few things during CPT uh, at this stage. So there are broadly two directions. So one, using parallel data or translated data, and two is to use Romanized data. So we'll go over these one by one. So when it comes to parallel data, the idea is very simple. I mean, you have sentences in language one, sentence in language two, so you can sort of concatenate the two, language one followed by language two, and vice versa, or like have some simple templates, and then add this to your pre-training data. Now, this data could either be in the form of parallel document or paragraph pairs, but very few such parallel document parallel level corpora exist. You're more likely to find sentence pairs across a range of languages. That is the data on which you can, uh, uh, that is the data mix you can add to your pre-training data. Now, what is the training schedule for this kind of parallel data? So one is, okay, you could do your monolingual uh, pre-training only. That is the standard pre-training with documents for where every sample is just one language, followed by the parallel examples. And this is typically what you would do if you are interested in building translation LLMs, because they really want to improve on the translation task, and exposing that model later to parallel data for pre-training makes sense. The other is, of course, I mean, you can interleave, you can jointly pre-train with both monolingual and parallel data, but the parallel data will have to be upsampled because it is going to be a lot more less than the amount of monolingual data you have available with you. One interesting experiment which the OpenHathi project did was to actually do the parallel pre-training first, with the uh, assumption that that will help to uh, align the language representation spaces upfront before we start doing monolingual pre-training, which will bring in uh, data from different languages when you're training multiple languages together. So that's about how you can do the training schedules. And is this useful? Is using parallel data during pre-training useful? So surely for the translation task, it is useful. And for the translation task, if you use high quality limited parallel data, that is sufficient. Uh, it is generally believed that using parallel data improves the ability of LLMs to understand and generate multilingual text, and many LLMs do that. Although there aren't very systematic results on the utility of parallel data in pre-training for downstream tasks when it comes to modern LLMs. But we can get some insights into it from previous work on encoder models and encoder decoder pre-trained models, BERT and BART-like models. And here it's sort of seen that using parallel data, one surely improves retrieval tasks as well as translation qualities significantly. There is also a modest amount of improvement on different tasks in a zero-shot setting where you are fine-tuning the model for on English, training data sets, and evaluating it on uh, other languages. So across different tasks with different very levels of improvement, you do see improvement. Okay. Right. So now we looked at parallel data, but we can use machine translation in another way. So we already noted that there is very little data, monolingual data for most languages, and therefore there isn't enough knowledge captured in language data. And transfer from English is challenging. And so, kind of the simple brute force approach is okay, can I generate content in the language of my interest at scale by translating a lot of English content? Right? And so that's what we're talking about now. So we need a decent MT model, and this could either be neural MT or LLM based translation, and uh, generate a lot of pre-training data using translation. Uh, both these approaches, at least in some evaluations, work fairly well. And MT, of course, will be far more efficient. Uh, and uh, of course, we cannot translate everything on the web into the language of our interest. That will be too much data for the model to train. But if we can be focused on high quality and knowledge intensive corpora like Wikipedia and FineWeb EDU, then that will be a very good source of uh, knowledge injection for pre-train into the new language. So as Safi showed previously, FineWeb EDU kind of improves language modeling performance and even downstream knowledge-rich task performance very fast. So translating this kind of high-quality data is useful. And what you can do is, what you would typically do is take these documents, translate them into the target language, but then in order to account for the quality of translations, you can filter out the translated documents using a small language model trained for the target language and only retain the high quality documents and then train the language model. So what we see when we do that is that uh, an LM trained on such machine translation data is competitive with native language models on many NLP tasks. And particularly, if you complement the machine translated data with a little bit of native data by towards the end of the pre-training, then that improves the quality. For small language models, in fact, synthetic data might outperform original data because maybe those distributions are simpler for the model to learn. What's also interesting is okay, model scaling, model size scaling applies even to machine translated data. So as you increase the model size, you see improvement in the uh, quality of the models uh, with even with empty data. Uh, Now, as you might imagine, if the data is if the language is low resource or medium resource and the empty quality is not that great, then empty data is less effective. Uh, Finally, okay, what is the limitation to using empty data for pre-training? So models trained on empty data are weak when it comes to linguistic proficiencies. Not all linguistic proficiency tasks, but certain kinds of linguistic proficiency tasks. And when it comes to cultural knowledge, which might not be captured in the original source English documents which you translated. And therefore, additional amount of CPT on small native data can make up for some of these gaps. So far, what I talked about was pre-training from scratch using empty data. But in the context of this we are interested in is what happens if my pre-training, uh, uh, I'm doing continual pre-training with machine translated data of a English heavy LLM, and even in that case, there are some results to show that there is improvement in downstream task performance. Okay. So finally, all this hinges on the fact that we are able to do high quality translation at scale. And to be able to do this, we need such a scalable pipeline. And when we were working on the Indic LLM suite project that Safi mentioned, we sort of built a highly scalable pipeline which can parallelize a lot of translations, which takes care of preserving the format of the translation of the documents to the extent possible. So these kind of things can help to uh, generate high quality data at scale, which can feed into the LM pre-training. Okay. Now we so far I talked about using uh, parallel data and monolingual data. But another interesting aspect is to look at can we use Romanized data? So what does Romanized data mean? So the language is written in the Roman script. Roman script is interesting because that's the script in which English is written, and therefore any transfer learning method, we might assume that it might work well if you represent the data in Roman script. Another important observation is that, okay, so it turns out that sometimes the Roman script actually has a lower fertility than the original script for some tokenizers. And this can be because there is a history of writing many of these languages in Roman script also, in addition to the standard orthography, especially in informal social media settings. And therefore, there is some amount of representation of Romanized data as well. And how does this help? So if you create Romanized representation via transliteration and add that to the pre-training mix, we can see that the Romanized data in this study has lower fertility compared to the native script, but that will depend on the tokenizer. And also the similarity of the Romanized representation to the English representation is higher than the uh, similarity of the same data represented in native script to the English corresponding English data, right? So which shows that they are better aligned to English and maybe can serve as either one way of representing the language in English heavy LLMs, or as a bridge to uh, align the English data and the language data in the native script. And there is work, there is some inherent alignment that naturally happens by simply pre-training, but you can explicitly have objectives also to sort of align the Romanized representation and the native representation, and this can help cross-lingual transfer in a variety of tasks. So with that, we kind of are at the end of our uh, this section of the tutorial where we looked at continual pre-training, and what we see is that continual pre-training can improve language competence and the model's so-called accessible knowledge. Uh, uh, and we should have high quality, diverse, and culturally relevant data. It is critical to maintain English task performance. There are a bunch of techniques to achieve that. Does parallel data improve cross-lingual transfer? It improves translation quality. It does improve cross-lingual transfer, but this is an area that there is scope to further investigate and do some research. Data augmentation techniques like romanization, code switching are also helpful. So with that, I'll end this part of the tutorial, and we can take some questions, and this is a good time to take I suppose we're scheduled for a break as well, right?
Yeah, in case any questions, please come up to the microphone. Yeah, please.
Hi, thanks for the nice tutorial. This is regarding that stop word removal. I totally agree we have to remove the toxic words, but I'm a bit concerned about removing stop words. Because do we really have to remove stop words? Because if we remove stop words, from a sentence, won't it affect the next token prediction?
No. So I think there was a small miscommunication there. I'm not saying if we have to remove stop words. I'm saying that documents should contain stop words, and we need to filter out those documents that don't contain enough stop words. So we'll come up with a threshold. That's kind of optimal in, okay, a language, a document in a particular language should contain maybe 10% of the words as stop words. Then we just keep those particular documents.
On the other hand, then how about rare words? Do you have to look at rare words as well? Because in one extreme we have stop words, on the other extreme we have rare words. Should we have to consider the occurrence of rare words as well?
I'm not sure what
Rare words. That means words that are not frequently occurring in documents. Those are the long tail of a language.
Okay, so I think there are a bunch of other filters also which consider vocabulary diversity, and I think we should keep them in the corpus. We should try if we can, somehow figure out documents containing those words, but that's not directly tied up to the stop word filter, if I'm not wrong.
No, it's the other extreme.
I think, for language diversity, for vocabulary diversity, I think we should have them. Yeah.
I have another question. How about the amount of data we need? For example, suppose we take a model like Llama 8B and we want to train it for a language a complete new language. How much data do you think we should have to get a decent result?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the correct answer is, but Anoop, sir, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's difficult to put a number, but we can look at it this way. So, what are the gamut of tasks we want to address? So, one is, of course, pure language competence in terms of language modeling. The data might not be a lot with a few billion tokens or even billion tokens. You might be able to achieve a certain level of language modeling. Then there is performance on certain NLP tasks, which requires some amount of understanding of common sense, simple knowledge, etc. And that might need a little bit more data. But then, if you want to excel in certain specific domains or if you want to be in general good at knowledge heavy tasks, then that will require a lot more data. And that's what we were pointing out earlier, that's the kind of data knowledge that doesn't even transfer easily from English. So you might need a lot of pre-training in that case. And what is useful in that case is what do you choose if you go down the empty route because English data is not sufficient. If you choose an English heavy resource like FineWeb or Wikipedia, which is knowledge heavy, and translate that will be probably uh, uh, a more optimal use of the compute available than randomly selecting data to pre-train.
Okay, thank you very much.
So concerning this one point about the use of translated data for cross-lingual transfer, there's this one paper I found recently from October 24, a comparison of language modeling and translation as multilingual pre-training objectives from Helsinki University. So I think maybe that might be something in this direction. Just wanted to get that out.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for pointing out. I haven't seen that particular paper. But yeah, thanks for pointing out. Take a look.
Sorry? Sure. Okay, any more questions? Yeah, if not, we can take a short break. We'll be back at, say, 4 p.m.
Okay, let's start with the next part of the tutorial. Hi everyone, I'm Thanmay. I'm a master's student at Vadvani School of Data Science and AI, AFR Bharat Lab, IIT Madras. And I'll be continuing with the next section, which is post-training. So we saw how we arrived at a language model, which is trained on a large amount of text data on the particular languages that we are interested in. And so post-training is a term that is used popularly in the recent year that denotes training, basically anything done post pre-training, hence the name post-training. And it's an umbrella term that broadly includes supervised instruction tuning, preference alignment, reasoning capabilities, and so on. And why we do this, we want to have chat capabilities for our LLM, and we want to interact with prompt and responses. So a brief outline. We'll be going through supervised instruction tuning, data creation strategies, training strategies, and a few ablations. And similarly for RL, we'll have a brief introduction and its use cases for preference alignment and reasoning. So to start with, supervised instruction tuning. So we have a recap of our CPT LLM, and using our IFT dataset, which is typically a triplet of instruction, input, and output, where, for example, take the task of summarization. The instruction would be something like, give the example of the following paragraph. The input would be that paragraph, and the output would be the reference summary in our dataset. And we use this dataset to fine tune our CPT LLM, and that's how we arrive at our IFT LLM. So this is done through the supervised modeling objective again, which is in practice the cross entropy loss. And so we minimize the loss between the predicted tokens of our model and the actual ground truth tokens of our dataset. So in other words, as we get better at predicting the expected tokens, the loss becomes lower and our model is better at following the instructions. So one thing to note here is that the loss is only computed over the output tokens, unlike how we did it in pre-training. This is because we want to train the model to respond to our prompt and not train the model to generate prompts. So if I ask an LLM to, let's say, write an essay on photosynthesis, I do not want the LLM to throw back me a series of other questions. Yeah, I would not like that. So train on in-language IFT dataset because we want instruction following in our language of interest. And to retain English task performance, we would include English in the IFT training as well. So this slide summarizes what we'll be going through. One, obviously, we need the instruction following data. And in addition to that, we would also be wanting to train it on auxiliary tasks. And in the end, we look at how we can transform existing IFT data sets using simple transformations. So yeah, let's look at these tasks in detail. First, how do we generate the IFT data? So English instruction following data sets already exist in plethora. So what would we see if we instruction tune the model on English instruction data set and evaluate on non-English data? So this is typically known as zero-shot cross-lingual evaluation because the model has not seen non-English data during instruction tuning stage. So these are some representative English IFD data sets. You can go through them. And let's look at some results. These are results on the AYA and 7B and 35 billion variants, and we fine tune it only on English. And this only makes sense because AYA is already pre-trained multilingually. So yeah, we do see some cross-lingual transfer happening even without any non-English fine tuning. So if you see the red box, that's the reference English performance. And for non-English languages, even though they're not as good as English, it is still significant because given that it's not seen non-English data, it's still significant to see such performance without any English data. And we see as we compare across the model parameter sizes, we see emergent zero-shot cross-lingual transfer as we increase the model parameters. Next, how do we generate in-language data? One, as we see during pre-training, we can also use machine translation. So what we do is translate the English instruction tuning data sets into the language and then fine-tune the model on the translated data set. So again, here we see that translating on instruction fine-tuning in language data outperforms only English instruction fine-tuning. So yes, instruction tuning on translated data does help the model to perform on non-English data. So we saw that translation is a popular approach. What should be the choice of translation engine is one question. So we could use off-the-shelf NMT systems, which are of higher quality, particularly for low resource, or we could use GPT. This can translate taking the entire context of input or output, or we could take a hybrid approach and do one of the following, depending on the language's translation quality. So typically what you would want to do is you have the set of languages that you want to work on and you survey across different translation engines and you have the data that you want to translate. And you would want to do a preliminary study of which model works best on which type of data. And accordingly, you can narrow down on what you want to translate and how you want to translate it. So this is a comparison between various translation engines. You can go through them. So now that we have translated data, again, we would need to do some quality filtering, because high quality examples are as important as the pre-training stage, even for instruction tuning. So we would want to use an MT evaluation metric like Comet QE to identify bad translations. And again, you could also use some rule-based filters to avoid code examples. You can use language identifiers, or you can filter based on the script. These are some, you could use some filtering techniques, similarly how you use in pre-training, and we arrive at our high quality IFT data. So now that we saw which model to use and how do we filter high quality examples, let's look at what to translate. So you could translate everything, right? You could translate instruction input and output. You could also do the translation of input and output only and retain the English instruction. This is motivated because English instruction is a common use case, and since models are already good at English instruction following, why not retain the English instruction? Or you could translate the instruction and input and pass the instruction and input in the target language to another LLM. You generate the response and then use that as your IFT data. This is important because we would, one, get more language and culture specific examples in a response, and two, we would have better fluency in the response. But let's take a pause here. We're just translating existing data sets. They might not be reflective of topics relevant to the language users. So for example, if I ask an LLM to give me some popular breakfast options, the response, like you could have some pancakes and eggs, may not be relevant in the target language or region culture. So therefore, can we synthetically generate SFT data sets that are culturally, locally, and region specific? Yes, one approach you can take is take the Wikipedia or any knowledge base that is specific to that region or culture, and then have some conversations with LLMs, generate the responses, and with this culturally grounded data, LLMs would generate culturally grounded responses, and then you can translate these conversations from English to target language. Now, why do we do data generation in English? This is obviously because LLMs are quite capable when it comes to English generation, but can we generate data and IFT data in the native language, even though there is these limitations of limited language support, quality of LLMs for multilingual generation may not be that good. There is a large possibility of hallucinations, factual inaccuracies, and cultural biases, but we may still want to do a small, high quality seed instructions and generate the entire examples from a strong LLM like GPT in target language. Again, you could do filtering and use methodologies like instruction back translation, which is generally train an LLM based on monolingual data that you have. You can back translate and get some instructions which you can use for culturally grounded instructions. So this table kind of summarizes what type of tasks that you want to synthesize, what is the approach you should do, and other things. So you need not go through them in detail right now, but each row tells you 4 things. One is what is the task, multilingual machine translation, summarization, and so on. What and from where do you get the data, and what is the approach you should take? And third, how we generate the data. Do we first generate the prompt and then the response, or do we generate the prompt and response together? And fourth, what should be the reasoning, or what should be the LLM's reasoning capabilities? Should it reason or non-reason on our input? So for example, if we take the multi-hop QA, how do we get it? We would generate the prompt and response together. And for reasoning, we would want it to reason across multiple time steps. So obviously we should use a reasoning model. So you could use this approach, and again, you would do quality filtering with strong multilingual LLMs. And if you have the bandwidth, you can validate it by human annotators. And you should if you have. So Another method is you can mix and match depending on your use case. So no single multilingual model is good for all scenarios. Some may be good in one language, some may be better in some other task. So you can take a mix and match approach, and maybe let's say one model is better at Spanish and your router is taking your input, and maybe it selects the best model on Spanish, similarly for tasks. So your router would typically is trained on a reward mechanism that allows your model to pick the right LLM for your use case. So let's look at the auxiliary tasks. So now we saw how to generate IFT data. In addition to IFT data, some other tasks may also indirectly help your downstream performance. So firstly, can we align the language spaces for better cross-lingual transfer of knowledge and skills? And can parallel data or script uniformity help achieve the goal? So again, yes, as we saw in pre-training, but in this case, what I like you to note down is that in the case of instruction fine-tuning, not only does it help in aligning the representations better, it improves the performance on other downstream tasks as well. So if you see the top right plot, it shows improved translation performance comparing other models. And if you see the bottom left table, it shows that adding translation data to your instruction data set can improve downstream performance on other tasks, not just translation. Now, again, Romanized representation, just like pre-training, using Romanized representation for IFT helps as well. And one thing to note is CPT with Romanized data is crucial. So if you've not done Romanized, if the model has not seen Romanized data in pre-training, more likely than not, it would not be able to recognize those Romanized representations. So if you have done Romanization during CPT, doing it in the instruction following stage helps the model performs boost even more further. Next, can we further improve the fluency of the target non-English language text? And can monolingual target language data help achieve the same? So using monolingual data, the main motivation is that we would want to improve the fluency of generation in the target language. So what we would do is expose a model to monolingual target language data during the instruction fine-tuning stage, incorporate a task that helps model generate more fluent output in the target language. So there are two things that we can do here. One is we can switch between the instruction following stage and the CLM objective in mini batches. So in this case, we would want to use apply the loss over the entire prompt, or you could frame the sentence completion as an instruction following task. So if you see the example here, the question is complete the following sentence, and you give the incomplete sentence and the answer is the complete sentence. So this way you have both instruction following being trained as well as text completion. Now towards the next subsection, what are some simple transformation techniques in addition to our instruction following task that we have? So we've done all this, but models are still better in English. What if we ask in the target language and use English as a proxy, or vice versa? So we saw how monolingual QA can be trained. We asked the question in Chinese, the answer is in Chinese. That's straightforward. What we can do during inference time is we translate the question into English, we get the answer through an English LLM, and we translate it back to source language. Or what we can do is monolingual QA with thinking in English, also known as cross-lingual thought prompting. So here we implicitly ask the LLM to think in English. It gets the answer in English and it implicitly translates it back to Chinese. So what we are doing here is multiple inferences are avoided. And since the input in original language is available to the LLM, it has the entire context and it's able to get better answers compared to just monolingual QA. But the downside is the increased token length, and so therefore it reduces the possible input token size. Next, we saw this improving performance in the zero shot and few shot settings. So if you see the highlighted rows, it's performing better than the basic prompting and translating it to English. So now we saw this in the inference time case. The one obvious method is why not do instruction following on such data. So yes, again, the performance improves for compared to standard IFT. You can see for Nepali and Persian, it significantly improves the downstream performance. But the limitation again is reduced maximum sequence length and increased latency. So another thing we can do is we have the question and answer in English. In non-English, again, we have using translation. So why not get 4 combinations? Because we have one source language, one target language. We have 4 combinations. And what this does is it helps the model to align languages and think in English implicitly without having to think. And so therefore, it reduces the latency, compared to cross-lingual thought prompting. And we jointly optimize on all these objectives, on all these combinations. Another thing you can do is code switched instruction data. So what you do is replace certain tokens in English to your target language or vice versa. This again helps the model to align better at sub-sentence level. And what some optimizations that you can do to improve the models further, you can retain the English instructions and code switch only the input and outputs. You can do code switching during pre-training as well. Now, another approach is you have the question and answer in English. You generate, again, you have the question and answer in your target language. But now here you generate the LLM response using the English question. You arrive at an alternative answer. And again, you translate that alternative answer to your target language. So again, this way you have 4 combinations. The main motivations for doing this is since you're using the model's own response, in turn, you're trying to improve the model's own representation space by doing so in the target language as well. So we saw all these methods. When we put all these together, let's see what happens. So you clearly see that combining all these methodologies significantly outperforms all the other methods like cross-lingual instruction tuning, cross-lingual thinking, and so on. And we see this for both English and target language. So English performance is still retained, which is important as we saw. So we saw that these simple data transformations help the LLM's own responses in a better way to improve cross-lingual transfer. We saw that the empty and sentence completion tasks are very useful, and the cross-lingual instruction tuning tasks are also complementary. And code switching on input and input side has modest benefits. So if you see the plot, before doing these transformations, you see that English and non-English are separated, but after doing these combinations, you see that they are more aligned together, which means better cross-lingual alignment. So now we'll be looking at certain interesting questions. So what happens if we increase the number of non-English language samples during instruction fine-tuning? Because we saw that only fine-tuning on English already has some significant performance. How much more data do we need for, let's say, small models and large models? So for small models, we see that multilingual performance improvements are task-dependent as we increase languages and language samples. But for large models, there is a multilingual performance plateau after the addition of 200 to 400 samples per language for each task. So for the following slides, we'll be looking at some interesting questions, and the x-axis will always be increasing the number of samples per non-English language. And in this slide, we see seen versus unseen language performance. So let's say we instruction fine-tune on English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and we do not fine-tune on, let's say, Chinese and Japanese, but we evaluate it during inference. So what we see is that unseen languages benefit from improvements on seen languages, but suffer if seen language performance deteriorates. So this means that the performance trend on unseen language is dependent on the seen language's performance trend. So how does multitask training benefit? Non-English languages benefit from task diversity in large models, and with sufficient scale, models are able to transfer to unseen languages for some tasks. Now, To compare script versus language, we see that cross-lingual transfer from Latin script languages is insufficient for non-Latin script languages. So there is a script dependency of cross-lingual transfer. And for some certain tasks like mathematical reasoning, it may benefit from Latin script data because it is not linguistically motivated as instruction following and summarization tasks. So to summarize, machine translation is a good starting point to create IFT data. Using LLMs to generate culture and region-specific data in English target language helps. Improving alignment between English and other languages using methods like cross-lingual instruction tuning, Romanized code switch data helps. And machine translation is an important task for cross-lingual alignment. So beyond multilingual IFT, what's next is what we'll be going through in the following slides. Two core challenges still remain. One is preference alignment. Responses may still not be well calibrated or nuanced. They may be unsafe, they may be biased, or they may be culturally misaligned across languages. And models often fail at multi-step thinking in multilingual scenarios. So that is more or less the next following sections. Before we go to the next section, which is reinforcement learning, let's open for some questions. Okay, if there are no questions, I'll hand it over to Raj, who will be starting with the reinforcement learning slides.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, Raj, you're audible.
Yeah, but sorry, will you change the slides for me?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, yeah, okay, cool. Hi, my name is Raj. I'm from Google Research Australia, and I'm also a visiting faculty at IIT Madras. And I'll be talking about, or basically giving an introduction of reinforcement learning in the context of multilingual LLMs, and also be talking about how reinforcement learning can be useful in enhancing multilingualism and cross-lingual transfer. Next slide. Okay, so why would we want to do RL in the context of these language expansions? It's because one thing is, regardless of language, we'd want the model to encourage different chains of thought without explicit supervision, because there's a limit to the amount of supervised data sets that we can have. So reinforcement learning provides a good opportunity for models to generate a variety of chains of thoughts, and we don't necessarily have to give supervisions of what these chains of thoughts need to be. We just need to give a reward to the final response, which we think is very good. The second thing is this approach of not having explicit supervision will save a lot of human effort, because if you've done some data annotation, you'll realize how time consuming, how exhausting it can be. The advantage of non-explicit supervision, again, as I mentioned, is you just give a very high level feedback. Like, for example, you don't need to make specific comments about what parts of the response are good. You just need to say, okay, the response is good. How good is it? You can give a score between 1 to 10, and that's it. That you don't need to worry about it. And the ultimate expectation is that many people think, I believe it to a certain degree only, that RL might help us unlock artificial superintelligence or artificial general intelligence. Next slide. Oh, what's this? Okay, I think the animation was messed up, but yeah, please finish it all the way to the end. Okay, good. Yeah, this is good. Sorry, go back. Okay, good. All right. So what will happen is, first of all, what is the typical flow of an RL model, right? We first have an instruction fine-tune model. We usually start with the instruction fine-tune model, because this is the model which we want to start exploring its own capabilities, and then we want to reward certain capabilities which we find to be very useful and important. So suppose you give it the sentence, what is the meaning of life? And then the IFT model will output multiple types of outputs, because when we sample the model, we can get a variety of outputs. So sometimes sometimes the model will say happiness, sometimes the model will say 42, sometimes it will say sadness. And we want to understand what is the value or what is the reward that we can give to each of these responses. So now the typical argument is that the typical way of understanding is that the meaning of life is in happiness. So usually that kind of a response will get a higher reward. And we have simplified this via a simple number, which is 5, which indicates a high reward. The number 42, the response 42 is given a kind. So it's not the best answer to this, but it is, if you've read Hitchhiker's the Hitchhiker series, then you will know that 42 is one of the kind of joke answers. And it is not the best response, but it is a reasonable response. You give it a score of 1. And then sadness, of course, is not the meaning of life. So you would give it a negative reward or a negative score. Now, what you have is you have the input prompt, you have a variety of responses, and you have the rewards associated with these responses. All of these are given into the RL training phase, and the outcome is an RL model. And this is the model which we hope has been significantly improved and now exhibits the preferences that people have given it during this feedback mechanism, and so on. All right, next slide. Okay, so reward mechanisms, there are a variety of reward mechanisms. And as you might go through the literature, you'll find out there is tons and tons of acronyms for different types of reward signals. But broadly, there are two sources of rewards. One is via human signals, which we broadly call as RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback. So essentially, what we do is we get human feedback on some responses of a model, and then we train a model to predict these human feedbacks or human scoring mechanisms. And then we use these reward models, so-called reward models, in the reinforcement learning step. The second possibility is we have non-human signals, and these can come in broadly 2 types. One is via machine feedback, which is RLMF, and that means you can take your response, give it to an external program, and depending on how that program executes, you can get a particular reward signal. The second is via a grading LLM or an AI model, which is broadly known as RLGF or RLAIF. GF stands for grading feedback, AIF stands for artificial intelligence feedback or AI feedback. And essentially, it means that you take a response, you give it to an LLM and ask it to give some kind of grading or some score to this particular response. Next slide, please. All right, okay, so just one back, because there's an overlaying thing. Yeah, okay, that's good. All right, so how do you build reward models from human feedback? So as I mentioned, there's a prompts data set where you will sample a variety of responses from an initial language model. You'll have a bunch of generated responses, which you'll then give to humans. So for example, if you have a single prompt and it generates, say, 10 answers, then you will give it to humans and you'll ask them to rank these answers in the order of preference. Now, you have the option to take a preferred response and a dispreferred response, and you can then train a reward model based on this preference versus this preference. Just one further. Yes, and the equation that you use to train these kind of reward models is essentially you take a prompt and a response, and you will generate some kind of a score. You'll take a prompt and another response, give it some kind of score, and then you just try to maximize the probability corresponding to this particular equation. It's a very straightforward equation. Note that this equation then simplifies into DPO and so on and so forth, but that's beyond the scope. But I recommend that you explore this equation a bit because it's very interesting in how it can be modified into a variety of modern reward signals or reward models that we use these days. Next slide, please. All right. So now I'm going to show you how rewards from machine feedback works. Suppose you have a prompt which says write a program to add 2 numbers. So the LLM produces some kind of a program. Now you want to know how good this particular response is, whether this program does the intended job or not. So we are going to simply give it to a particular, let's say, a compiler. So if it's a Python program, essentially you give it to the Python interpreter, get it to execute this program, and then depending on what is the consequence or the outcome of execution, you're going to have different scores. So for example, if the program executes and gives the correct output based on some test cases, then you give a high score of 5. If the program executes, but it does not give a the desired correct output, or it misses some test cases, then you give it a low score, which is 1. But if the program does not execute at all, this is an undesired output, so you'll give it a score of -1. Very straightforward. You just rely on an external execution. Now, what about AI feedback? We'll take the case of translate to Japanese, of machine translation, where you want to translate to Japanese the sentence, I am happy. So the correct translation of this is watashi wa ureshi desu, and you would give it to a model, which, let's say it's a model which gives you how good this translation is. XComet is one such example of a model, and watashi wa ureshi desu, because it's a ideal translation, you give it a score of 1.0. Now, undesirable translation, because it's not exactly fluent but captures the overall essence, is the second response, which is watashi wa ureshi de gozaimasu. It's not a natural translation, but it still captures the essence of happiness, so therefore you'd give it an intermediate score of 0.5. But then watashi wa kanashi desu is the wrong translation, because kanashi means sad in Japanese, and then you'd get a score of 0. And if you wanted to essentially switch to LLM, then this LLM will have to be given criteria, whether the translation is of the correct language, whether there's the right formality in the response, blah, blah, blah. You give an LLM criteria, then it takes the prompt, it takes the response, the criteria, and judges whether this criteria have been fulfilled or not, and gives similar scorings. Next slide, please. All right. So now, yeah, please go to the next slide. Next. All right. So now I'm going to talk about multilingual preference alignment. And one of the key questions is whether the target language reward model, how much of an impact this has. So now there is a possibility that you have the reward data or reward modeling data, which is in English. Now, what you could do is you can simply translate this reward modeling data into a target language, and you can have a reward model for that particular target language. And then you can essentially use this in a PPO style approach to then do reinforcement learning on an existing model. Next. However, this is not the only way to do this. There is another approach, which is essentially generating the completions in English versus directly translating everything. So what would be the first way? The first way would be you have English prompts. You translate these English prompts into target language prompts. You then give it to an LLM to have target language completions, and these would then be scored by humans. The second possibility is you have the English prompts where you have the completions generated in English. You then translate the completions into the target language, and then you can score these particular translated completions and create a reward model. Now, depending on which route you go, you might have a different impact on your model. Next slide. Yes. Yeah, no, it's okay. Can you go back a bit? So one point I want to emphasize over here is that translating prompts and then generating a response to those prompts will actually encourage a lot of diversity. On the other hand, if you are translating responses of English completions, then you might end up with a lot of translationese and therefore have very unnatural responses. So you have to be very careful depending on what you want to optimize for. Next slide, please. Okay, so during RL, you have to have two main considerations. One consideration is the number of languages involved during RL, and the second is the amount of data that you use during RL. Now, this slide, what it is simply showing you is, if you look at each of these plots, it is telling you what is the impact of different RL algorithms like RLOO and DPO, depending on the number of training languages during your RL step. And one thing is pretty clear is that algorithms like RLOO and in general DPO tend to have improving performance for different tasks as indicated by the win rate as the number of languages increase. Of course, since these are just only three data points, these might not indicate a general trend, but in my personal experience, I've observed that it is just better to include as much multilingual data as possible during your RL step, because that leads to better generalization and better transfer learning. Next slide. Yeah. And here we are simply exploring the impact of the number of training instances during RL. And the main takeaway over here is that the more training instances you have during RL, the better it is. Because what happens is the overall amount of information that you're going to be giving to your final model during the RL step is primarily a function of the number of prompts. So the more prompts you have, the more diverse prompts you have, the more varied task prompts you have, the more signals you can give to the model, and essentially it will end up learning more and more capabilities. If you only have like a handful of prompts with, let's say, only specific type of questions being asked, then the model will only optimize for these specific types of tasks. They won't go beyond that. So try to add as much data as possible during your RL step, the caveat being that RL can be very expensive, especially if you have very long responses. So sometimes you need to have a trade-off and then kind of optimize for a subset of your data. But yeah, depending on the compute, if you have ample compute, then definitely go for more RL instances, more training instances. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that leads to an important question. If you're doing multilingual training during RL, and if you're using reward models during RL, of course, which is very important, the question is, can you use English reward models in cross-lingual settings? And specifically by that, what I mean is reward models are typically going to be trained on a lot of English data because that is the most abundant reward modeling data that you have. Now, we know for a fact that many models tend to exhibit multilingual capabilities, even if they're trained only on English data. So that the key question over here is, can I take a reward model that has been primarily been trained on English preference data, but somehow has multilingual capabilities, instead of using a reward model that has primarily been trained on some target language reward modeling data? And what this slide is showing you, essentially, to summarize, is that if you took a reward model that is optimized on Spanish data for reinforcement learning for Spanish prompts, then you might not get the best possible performance as compared to taking a reward model trained on English data for optimizing, for doing reinforcement learning on Spanish prompts. In other words, what it shows is that existing models which have been trained on English reward modeling data actually have a good enough capability to do reward modeling for any other language because of the implicit cross-lingual transfer of reward modeling that takes place. Now, which is very interesting, right? Which means you don't really need to create preference data in the target language that much. You could simply create a lot of preference data in English, and that kind of generalizes to other languages. But this might be a very smooth overview. There might be certain tasks and certain languages which do not benefit from this. So this requires a lot more exploration. Next slide, please. Right. So this slide essentially is reinforcing the same exact thing, where it is giving the context of a baseline model, which has not seen any kind of reinforcement learning. And what is very clear over here is that a reward model based on English only data is going to be much better, or at most as good as a reward model which is based on target language reward modeling data. But yeah, there's no new, this is just adding some more context to the previous slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so now one other important thing is most of the times it will happen that your prompts will be in language A and your response will be in the same language. But there are cases where your prompts will be in language A, but your response will be in language B. These are cross-lingual generations. So therefore, there will be a bunch of cross-lingual cases for your preference data set. And one key takeaway from a paper on XLLMs shows that cross-lingual feedback data leads to better generalization compared to monolingual feedback data. In other words, if your prompt is in language A and if your response is in language B, and you have preference information or human feedback on these kind of prompts, then And if you include these kind of reward models, these reward models lead to final models which have better cross-lingual generalization. It's because the reward model is now able to capture cross-lingual semantics, and that encourages the model to perform cross-lingual generations more effectively. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, one thing, I mean, I think this should be fairly obvious in the sense of, if you've done quite a bit of supervised fine tuning versus RL, you might actually note that the amount of cross-lingual transfer that can take place during SFT is pretty decent, but the amount of cross-lingual transfer that takes place during RL is a lot more, because during SFT, we give specific token-wise supervision. This might actually not end up leading to cross-lingual representations being very well aligned at different points in the model. But in RL, because we don't do explicit token level supervision, or even if we do it, we have the concept of a broad sequence level reward. This encourages a lot more cross-lingual transfer as compared to individual token level supervision. And the finding in the paper, which is linked over here, essentially shows that when you do reinforcement learning, it leads to a significant amount of cross-lingual transfer, which is much more, let's say, tangible than the amount of cross-lingual transfer that takes place during SFT. In fact, they have shown that SFT can sometimes lead to negative transfer, which is very undesirable, but reinforcement learning tends to avoid that and only has, more often than not, has only positive transfer. Next slide, please. Yeah, just please go. Yeah. Now, on the topic of using, RL AIF or RLGF, one of the questions is, if I'm using an AI model and or if I'm using an LLM, can I use an LLM as a judge for all of the language? So in other words, if you have prompts in English, responses in English, and if I use, let's say Gemini, or if I'm using Quen or whatever multilingual model, can I use this model consistently for getting rewards for every other language as well? As in, if my prompts are in Spanish and my responses are in Spanish, can I rely on the same Gemini model to give very reliable reward signals? And according to this work on multilingual judge reliability, what they have shown, what they have analyzed is whether there is a consistency in the LLM's judge results between English and other languages. So in other words, what they do is, for the same kind of prompts across different languages and same kind of responses, of course, they figure out whether the LLM as a judge grades these responses consistently across different languages or not. And which means what we really want is, if I have a prompt in English and I have a good response, and if I have a prompt in Japanese and if I have a good response to it, then if the responses are equally good, then my LLM as a judge should be able to give consistent rewards for both responses. However, what happens is, most existing models that people have tried out, like GPT-4o, Quen 2.5, and Aya expands, the correlation is good for certain languages, but it is not always consistent. So in other words, a particular LLM might give a good response in English, one score, but an equally good response in another language might not be getting a good enough score. So you kind of have to be very careful. You have to make sure that your LLMs as judges are really consistent across different languages, because what will happen is, if the two responses across different languages have two different scores, then during the RL step, if some cross-lingual transfer is to take place, these might be in conflict with each other, and that might not really help the final model. So you have to be very careful. Next slide, please. So overall, the summary is that during RL, try to have more languages because it helps generalize to unseen languages. In the absence of the target language reward model, English reward model helps. Mind you that these English reward models will be based on bidirectional BERT-like models, and they won't be based on these decoder-only models. More instances, more data during RL helps improve alignment. I mean, I think this is something that's being thrown around quite a bit, right? Everybody wants to scale RL. Everybody wants to scale to millions and millions of instances. So, and we've seen the gradual impact of, scaling up RL, and this is proving to be true over time. And one other thing is, if possible, try to have cross-lingual data during RL for better alignment, including cross-lingual reward data sets, as well as prompts which are inherently cross-lingual in nature. And that's basically the overview of how reinforcement learning can be useful for cross-lingual transfer in the context of language expansion. Handing it off to Thanmay again.
Yeah. So before we go on to reasoning capabilities expansion, do we have some questions from the crowd? Okay, if not, let's hand it over to Rudra, who will handle the multilingual reasoning.
Thank you, Thanmay. Am I audible?
Yes, Rudra, you're audible.
Yeah. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Rudra Murthy. I'm a staff research scientist at IBM. So, today I'll be covering about multilingual reasoning models. So, even before going into multilingual reasoning models, let's ask the question, right? What do we even mean by reasoning in LLMs? Or what do we mean by large reasoning models? So, large reasoning models or specialized LLMs which have been explicitly trained to perform multi-step reasoning. Unlike traditional LLMs where you can elicit chain of thought reasoning, these LLMs have been explicitly trained to perform multi-step reasoning. And what the intuition behind is, let's say you have a very complex mathematical question, right? And you ask an LLM to solve it. Now, it would be very difficult for the LLM to just generate the answer as, I mean, the very next token as the answer. However, if you can ask the LLM to decompose the problem into sub problems, try to solve these individual sub problems, and then arrive at a solution, it is capable of doing it. So that's the whole intuition behind having these large reasoning models. So, sorry, can you please go back to the previous slide? So typically these large reasoning models, they have a special token called think token. Within this think token, they express the entire reasoning process. And then after the think token, the final answer would be generated. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So, okay, we have defined what a large reasoning model is. Now the immediate question is, okay, there are many large reasoning models available in the literature. Um, Now, how do they perform when in a multilingual scenario, or do what's their multilingual capability? And another question which we want to ask is, you have these open source or open weight models and closed weight models. Do we see a significant multilingual capability lacking in the open weight models compared to closed weight models? Now, if you look at this table, you have frontier models like ChatGPT, GPT-4, etc. And if you look at their performance on English and compare their performance to other languages, right? Say, for example, German or Spanish or French, they are not very lacking in the sense the performance is not very poor. In fact, they're close to the English performance. At the same time, if you look at very low resource languages like, say, Bengali, you see the performance significantly drops from 80 to 17.6. So these closed weight models or frontier models do exhibit multilingual reasoning for high resource languages. However, when we look at very low resource language, the reasoning capability is hampered. Okay, these were like frontier models, but how do the open weight models fare? If you look at the open weight models, we see the open weight models perform poorly even for English compared to these frontier models, and their performance on low resource languages is very bad, like, say, 17.6 to 6.4. So this is a common pattern which we see between open source models and these frontier models. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. Now what we saw is, okay, there are large reasoning models which have multilingual capability. Now the question which we want to ask is, okay, they are generating their reasoning process. When they're generating the reasoning trace, do they have any bias towards a particular language? Like, let's say I ask some question in Thai, and will the LLM be able to generate the reasoning in Thai language, or does it try to prefer some other language like English? So going on to the next slide. And what people have observed is, especially this is true for open weight models, irrespective of the input language, the LRMs tend to reason in English, and this is pretty prominent when it comes to open weight models compared to closed weight models. Okay, going on to the next slide. Okay, now what we saw was okay, as the reasoning model, some question in, let's say, Swedish, but instead of generating the reasoning trace in Swedish, it is generating the reasoning trace in English and then spitting out an answer. Now, can I control this behavior? What happens if I explicitly inform the LRM to generate the reasoning trace in Swedish instead of English? Let's go to the next slide. And people have tried this, and what they have observed is forcing non-English reasoning often hurts the performance. So as you can see, the performance drop is very significant, irrespective of the language of the query. Now, why not use English as the reasoning language, right? Why do we even care about, say, asking the LRM to generate the reasoning trace in the language of the query? There are many points. One is to avoid this cross-lingual semantic drift. So internally, what happens is we ask a query in language L. Now the model tries to figure out what the query is and tries to solve it. Now in the figuring out phase depends on how well the internal spaces are aligned, or I mean the internal representations. If the representations between the languages are not well aligned, then there could be a semantic drift due to translation errors, or there could be language or culture specific concepts which is encoded in the language but not in English, and that could also lead to the model spitting out a wrong answer. In addition to that, it also brings in some notion of reliability or trustworthiness. Okay, I ask a question in, let's say, um, Swedish itself, and I see the reasoning trace. I can look at the reasoning trace and get some idea of is the model actually understanding the question or not? Can I trust this answer or not? So in order to ensure this, we want to ensure that the reasoning trace is also in the language of the query. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Now, is thinking in English always better? That's true. English COT is often better, but it's not always the case. For example, you can see for certain language pairs and certain models, say reasoning in the target language is better than reasoning in the reasoning in English. And what people have also observed is, say, when we provide this chain of thought reasoning in English, right, or when we provide the query in a non-English language, it can often lead to translation errors because of the internal alignment in the LLM. Going on to the next slide. Yeah. So there are use cases where we want, what people have observed is when the reasoning is in the native language, the performance improves. And this is crucial for use cases like if you want to reduce toxicity, or if you're querying the LLM for information which is culture specific or region specific, then reasoning in native language is the preferred way. Moving on to the next slide. Now, okay, we looked at, say, what is the preferred language for reasoning. Now, does this correlate with task difficulty? Like, is it the case that when the task is very easy, it doesn't matter in which language I'm reasoning? But if the task is very hard, then reasoning in one language is better than reasoning in the other language. Let's try to see if there's an answer. Going on to the next slide. Yeah, what people have observed is if you have easy task, the reasoning language does not matter much because the performance is more or less the same. But as you increase the task difficulty, reasoning is English is more beneficial compared to reasoning in the language of the query. And this is true for both high resource language as well as low resource languages. However, the gap between high resource language and low resource language is still larger. Going on to the next slide. Okay. Now we have observed this phenomenon, right? Like, irrespective of the query of the language, the model tends to reason in English predominantly. And this is called as cross-lingual collapse. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah. So cross-lingual collapse happens when a reasoning model tries to reason in English rather than reasoning the language of the query. And ideally, what we want is, if you look at the graph, you have math accuracy in the x-axis and joint math and language accuracy on the y-axis. What language accuracy here me refers to is, you look at the reasoning trace and try to identify the language of the reasoning trace. If the language of the reasoning trace matches the language of the query, then it's a 1, otherwise it's a 0. So ideally, we want it to lie on this diagonal entry, but what we see is existing models, they fare far away from this ideal point, indicating that the reasoning language is not always the language of the query. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, we know that the reasoning language is predominantly English, and we tried using some prompts like informing the model to reason in the language of the query, but that did not help. Can we do something? Because we want the model to reason in the language of the query. We don't want it to use English all the time. So for that, let's look at this work called as M2A, where they try to overcome this multilingual collapse. What the authors propose is, can we use RL to enforce or to ensure that the model always reasons in the language of the query rather than English? So in order to ensure that, they define various reward mechanisms. Yeah, the first reward mechanism is pretty straightforward. Let's say you have a question and the ground truth in English. What you do is, you translate the question into the target language. Once you have the question in the target language, you provide this as input to the LLM, and the LLM generates multiple responses. And now you try to calculate the reward for each of the response based on how correct or incorrect is it with respect to the query In addition to this reward, what they also do is, they introduced 3 additional rewards. One is the multilingual context alignment. So in multilingual context alignment, what they do is, they look at the English reasoning trace and they look at the generated reasoning trace, and then they try to calculate the cosine similarity. And in order to calculate the cosine similarity, they use an embedding model. Now, if I just use this reward mechanism, right, what would happen? If the language model generates the reasoning trace in English, then I would achieve an I cosine similarity, right? We don't want to have that. So for that, what they say is, this was my positive reward. Let me also define some negative rewards. And in order to define negative rewards, what they do is, they take the English reasoning trace, shuffle or permute the words in the reasoning trace, and apply the same permutation on the generated reasoning trace, and they calculate the cosine similarity, and they call this as negative rewards. So if the model tries to generate a similar reasoning trace in English, then the positive reward would be I, but also the negative reward will also be I, because once you shuffle or apply the same permutation on the English reasoning trace and also on the generated reasoning trace, they'll be having I cosine similarity. But if it was in a different language, that won't be the case. So this was at the entire reasoning trace level. What they also say is, let's do it at individual steps. So that's where the multilingual reasoning step alignment comes into picture. You split the reasoning trace into multiple sentences, and at every sentence level, you provide a reward. And finally, they have the language consistency reward. So they look at the reasoning trace generated, identify the language. If the language matches to the query language, then you provide a positive reward. Otherwise, you provide a negative reward. Moving on to the next slide. And what they observe is, if you perform vanilla supervised fine tuning, it improves accuracy in both English and non-English languages on the downstream task as expected. However, if we look at the language accuracy, so if you look at the first table, MGSM, we have the math accuracy as well as the language accuracy. So the language accuracy gets hampered because that the model is trying to generate the reasoning trace in English rather than the reasoning trace in the query language. However, the downstream task performance has improved a lot. What they also try is, what if I do supervised fine tuning on the translated data, right? So what they observe is, on the math, they observe a drop. However, on the language accuracy, they see an improvement. And finally, they say, we'll apply our M2A approach. It improves all metrics. However, the improvement in, say, non-English math performance is not that significant. So for example, 58.82 or 59. However, if you just perform vanilla SFT, it jumps from 58.8 to 66.7. However, this comes at the additional cost of reasoning being in non-English language rather than the query language of the query. Moving on to the next slide. So MThinker is another approach which tries to improve upon M2A. So MThinker, similar to M2A, also introduces several rewards. The first reward is the language consistency reward, which is the same as what we saw in M2A. In addition to that, we also have this cross-lingual thinking alignment reward, the same as M2A contextual alignment reward, but instead of using an embedding model, here they use an LLM to score the reasoning trace between the English and the target language. And finally, they have this format reward. So we want, say, the reasoning trace to be within a particular, say, within think tags. Now, what if the LLM doesn't follow that particular format? So we want to penalize it. So for that, you have the format reward. And what they claim is having all these reward mechanisms helps not only boost the performance on the downstream task, which can be seen in the table, but also improve the language consistency performance. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so now let's look at another approach, right? So this was, this paper got published in EMNLP 2025 itself. So here they take a different route to handle cross-lingual collapse. I guess this is not the latest version of the slide. So basically, instead of just doing RL, what the authors propose is train the model in multiple stages. In the first stage, you perform supervised fine tuning. And to perform supervised fine tuning, what you do is you collect a small number of high quality data sets in the target language and just do vanilla SFT, nothing else. And what they see is in doing so, uh, in domain performance improves, and that comes at the expense of out of domain performance. Now going on to the next slide. Once you have this SFT model, what you do is you apply GRPO on top of it. And even when you're applying GRPO, you need to ensure that you use iClip and you don't use any KL divergence. And the authors observe that having this knob ensures that the model doesn't revert to English for reasoning. So let's say you're doing GRPO kind of RL and the LLM generates multiple reasoning traces, and English reasoning trace is also generated. We don't want the model to fall back to the English reasoning trace, right? We want the model to go back to the target language reasoning trace, especially if the model got the answer wrong. So having these knobs helps prevent it. And what they see is GRPO not only improves on top of the SFT, but it also retains the language accuracy. And also out of domain performance also improves a bit, as can be observed from the graph. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah. And finally, they also try model merging, where they try to merge multiple models. And what they see is merging also improves performance. There's a slight drop in domain performance when you perform merging, but the out of domain performance improves. So model merging is another technique which can be tried if so that we can ensure that not only the performance improves, but also the model tries to reason in the language of the query. Yeah, moving on to the next slide. Okay. So till now, what we have done is we have looked at what multilingual reasoning models are, their capabilities in different languages, their performance on high resource, low resource languages. We looked at this cross-lingual collapse. But the question is, how do we train these multilingual reasoning models, right? Let's look at distillation-based approaches for training such multilingual reasoning models. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah. So as we saw in the case of IFT also, what we could do is we could distill native chain of thought from English. So basically what it means is you have question answer pairs in English, you give it to a reasoning model, you generate the reasoning trace in English, and after applying some quality filters, you translate it to the language of interest. Moving on to the next slide. Or what you could do is you can take question answer pairs in the target language itself. You give it a large reasoning model. Now the reasoning model generates a chain of thought reasoning or multi-step reasoning. Now you apply some checks and bounds on the data, and you get the reasoning data in the native language. So we call this as native COT and the previous one as English COT. Yeah, moving on to the next slide. Now, which is better? So basically what people have observed is using translated English chain of thought reasoning dataset leads to larger improvements across languages compared to using, or compared to, say, taking the target language question answer pair, giving it a reasoning model, generating the reasoning trace in the target language. And this scales across parameter sizes too. As you increase the model capacity, the performance increases. However, the performance using target COT is still very low. I mean, if you use say 15 billion parameter model and train it using the target COT, the performance is still not comparable with, let's say, using a 1.5 billion parameter model with translated English COT. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. Uh, yeah, so basically this slide also summarizes the same. Do you want to use translated COT data, or do you want to use native COT data? And across the language pairs, what we see is translated COT outperforms distilled COT. One thing to note here is the task here was math, and this need not be the case. For example, if you want to train an LLM for safety alignment, or if you want to train an LLM to ask specific queries about a particular culture or region specific, then whatever observations we have made in this slide might not be applicable. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah. So to summarize, we looked at what large reasoning models are, and we saw that these LRMs can perform better in English irrespective of the query language. However, when we have, say, culturally sensitive queries or something with which has to do with safety alignment, etc., reasoning in query language is better than reasoning in English. And we looked at several approaches to enforce the reasoning to happen in the language of the query. And one such guideline is perform supervised fine tuning using a small number of high quality data in the target language, and then do GRPO on top of it. That leads to a better reasoning model, and also ensures that the language of the I mean, the reasoning trace language is the same as the query language. And fine tuning using translated reasoning traces seems to be better than fine tuning on reasoning traces generated natively. This could also be attributed to existing LRMs are still poor compared for for low resource languages. And if you use such an LRM to generate reasoning trace in the query language, the reasoning trace might be harmful. Okay. Now I'll hand over to Thanmay. Thanks.
Yeah, do we have any questions? Okay, and Safi will take over the multilingual evaluations.
Okay, great. So we are nearly towards the end, and we just wanted to end with a brief intro on what type of evaluations one has to do. Given all the training that you've seen, evaluations are one way of checking how well your model improvement is happening. So my intention here is not to go into the results as much. I'll try to focus on the different strategies that you can use to create your benchmarks or create your evaluations, everything. So to start off, a broad taxonomy of evaluations. What are the things that we are looking to evaluate? First thing is styles of evaluation. You can evaluate it either using benchmarks or something called in the wild evaluations. In benchmarks, you again have MCQ-like benchmarks, which are all the academic stuff that you see, MMLU and etc. And you've got generative first benchmarks, wherein LLM is actually required to produce a long answer. And in the wild evaluations, you have something called vibe evaluations, which is something that you typically try out LLMs and feel how, I mean, if you feel happy about it, you're good. I mean, you're confident that that LLM is good for you. Those are basically vibe evals. And there are a lot of arenas that are in place. For example, LM Arena is one of the more popular ones. And after looking at styles of evaluation, there are a bunch of abilities that we would want to evaluate. You would want the model to perform well on the standard NLP tasks that you have. You would want the model to work well on knowledge tasks, math, reasoning, instruction following, chat, multiple such things are present. And finally, the metrics, gold standard, of course, human evaluations, Then you've got a bunch of accuracy and variance. You've got blue score and variance. You've got rouge and variance. You've got embedding based metrics like BERT score and variance. And finally, something that's quite popular nowadays, that's LLM as a judge approach. So these three things broadly capture the three main core questions that are responsible for evaluation. That is, where to evaluate, what to evaluate, and how to evaluate. And this is my intention in this is to cover all of these three things to some extent. So let's look at modern LLM evals. That's the first step, that is benchmarks. This is a quick overview of the different capabilities that people typically look to evaluate. You've got knowledge and academic, and the famous benchmarks are, of course, MMLU, MMLU Pro. You've got conversation ability benchmarks. You've got empty bench, wild bench, big gen bench. This is just like a ready reckoner that's there. Then what are the different evaluation paradigms that one would follow? And this is kind of inspired from LM eval harness. So first method for MCQ like benchmarks is the conditional log likelihood method, wherein the idea is that you take a prompt and you append it with one of the options, and you check what's the log likelihood of that option. Then you append it with the second option, you check what's the log likelihood of that, and so on. And the option that gives you the most log likelihood, that's probably your correct answer. Second thing is rolling log likelihood, which is basically perplexity. As the model is generating the response, you keep accumulating these log likelihoods, and that forms your perplexity. Third thing is generate until, wherein you either define some sort of stopping criteria for the LLM, or you let the LLM generate a response till the end of turn or end of sequence token is predicted. So a brief information about the different frameworks that are available for evaluation. One thing, the most famous probably is the LM evaluation harness. And it's a very nice platform, a very nice framework that one can use for getting these reproducible evaluations. Because in LLM world, getting reproducible evaluations is quite tough because there are various factors that come into picture, and this somehow solves your orchestration problem. You can simply go and create these config files wherein you can define what the prompt is, what metric you want to use, what strategy you want to use, and it kind of takes care of everything. There are a bunch of other frameworks that I've just listed down for reference. Now we had seen all the previous things that we've seen is for the English world, what happens in the multilingual world. And just as a short, I would say cry for help is this plot, which is a very recent survey that has come out, wherein this is a distribution of all the multilingual benchmarks, the top 50 languages in the different multilingual benchmarks that are present. And this is excluding English-only benchmarks. And we still see that English is the language that is mostly covered by everyone. And gradually, there's a huge long tail with very minimal benchmarks. So this is like initiative for all of us to go ahead and start creating benchmarks that are inclusive of all languages, that take into account different communities, etc. Now, strategies for creating benchmarks, three broad strategies that I'll be covering in this. You've got machine translation, adaptation, and creating from scratch. Quickly going through over all of them. First thing is translation, which is quite straightforward. You've got your English benchmarks. You've got some sort of translation system, which is either a specialized model or an LLM-based model, and then you get your translated benchmarks. What are the benefits of it? Of course, it's quick and easy. You can easily get started with your benchmarking, and it's you easily leverage all the cognitively heavy work that has happened for English benchmarks, and you can use all the high-quality test sets that have already been created, and it also enables this fair cross-lingual comparison, wherein you have the performance for English, you can check how well the model is performing for your language. There are a bunch of challenges, of course. First thing is translation ease, wherein it introduces some sort of a semantic drift, or it may result in mistranslation. For example, if you look at this sentence, it's raining cats and dogs, which means it's raining heavily. If you translate, there are certain systems which can do a literal translation of this, which means if you read Hindi, it says, ये बिल्लियों और कुत्तों की बारिश हो रही है, which literally means it's raining cats and dogs, whether you actually wanted to translate that as मुसल्लधार बारिश हो रही है, which means it's raining heavily. Second challenge is that there is a loss of cultural grounding. So for example, in English, asking the first question, that's the question on the left, would make more sense because that's the type of questions what people typically ask. But when you translate that question, let's say to Hindi, that may not make too much sense. It may not add too much value. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it wouldn't add too much utility in your, your evaluations. Rather, it would be better to have the question on the right, which is actually asking something about the Indian context. Hindi, for example, is an Indian language. People may ask the right question more often than the left question. So it would help if you can culturally ground your benchmarks so that you get much more real world performance. Another interesting challenge is difficulty in preserving task properties. So for example, some tasks may lose the discriminative properties that they have. So for example, the first example that I have there, that's a very famous example from the Vinograd challenge. The trophy didn't fit in the suitcase because it was too small. And the challenge is what is meant by it here. But when you translate to Hindi, there are certain systems which will literally add the answer in the statement itself. For example, this translated sentence literally translates to the trophy didn't fit in the suitcase because the suitcase was too small. Now the task is entirely vanished. There's no discrimination required there. Similarly, if you have another task like, okay, translate the given sentence to French, and then you have an English sentence. Let's say I'm getting this benchmark in Russian. It will also translate the entire Russian sentence also. The task is still fine, but the way, the intended message is then lost. There are a bunch of solutions, of course. First thing is you can use some sort of human in the loop. It's very expensive, but that's the gold standard. Or you can try some heuristic-based approaches like back translation, which is a very common method in the machine translation world. Another option is you can use certain LLM-based translation approaches because LLMs are quite good at instruction following. You can literally prompt it in your specific fashion to maybe translate certain parts and ignore certain other parts. There are benefits and drawbacks, of course, but the drawback is that your LLM needs to be, the LLM that you are using needs to be well aware in this particular language. But irrespective of this, translation is still a very good, reasonable, good alternative. If you look at this table, the values that are there on the left are the scores for human translated benchmarks, and the value that is there on the right is the score from machine translated benchmarks. And for a lot of them, it's nearly the same. So translation is still a very good starting point for you. Similarly, this is another effort by, another plot by Global MMLU, which is a very famous benchmark, wherein machine translation and human translation performances are quite similar. One weird thing happens for low resource languages, let's say like Yoruba, wherein translated benchmarks start shooting up. You get much better performance on the translated benchmarks. And the reason for that is since Yoruba doesn't have too much data that's present on the web, people typically tend to use translated data for training the models, and that is much more better in distribution to the translated benchmarks. Some existing approaches on how people have used translation to create the benchmarks. This is one of the pipelines. I won't go into too much detail. This is just like a broad overview of what is possible. So apart from translation, as you can see, you can have different steps in between, wherein the LLM is either reflecting on its own, adding some more corrections, and then finally validating it. Similarly, you can have a human in the loop also, wherein the initial translation, maybe it's done by an LLM, and human is then correcting them to make it better. Now, after translation, we go into adaptation, wherein it tries to fix some of the problems that we had seen previously. And the idea here is that you either adapt certain thing and then translate, or translate and then adapt. What do I mean by this? This is one of the examples. So if you look at the first question, in English, it is how did US states get their names? But let's say after translation and adaptation, the better question to ask would be, how did the provinces of China get their names? That is much more culturally grounded. The benefits of this, of course, it preserves cultural and linguistic relevance. It also maintains the task difficulty as well as the intent. And to some extent, it also enables fair cross-lingual comparison. Again, as there are benefits, there are challenges. You require significant human effort here. Either you need translators who understand the task logic and the target culture, or you need experts who are proficient in that particular language. That's a very niche area that you're looking for. Or else the other alternative is you use LLMs to create these cultural artifacts, but it's like an interesting chicken and egg problem wherein you're using LLMs to evaluate, you're using LLMs to create the benchmarks, and then you're using those benchmarks to evaluate the same LLMs again. That's why the better option is to use some sort of LLM and human combination approaches. And this is exactly one such approach wherein you first translate your benchmarks to different languages. In this case, they've used ChatGPT as the translator. Then for the questions that for which localization is possible, that is cultural grounding is possible, you then ask some humans to localize them. Or for the ones that don't require any cultural elements like maths and other things, you can directly go ahead. The third option is creating from scratch. Again, bunch of possible options here. You can either replicate the exact process that the English folks had used to create their benchmarks. And these are some of the efforts that have done that. Second thing is you can collect, these benchmarks from various existing sources, like how MMLU and various versions of MMLU that have come out for different languages have done. And you can use some sort of LLM-driven grounded synthetic benchmarking approaches. That was about benchmarks. And then let's look at metrics, how to evaluate. That's the how to evaluate question. Bunch of disadvantages of existing metrics. These are very well studied in the literature, so I'm not going to go into too much details. I just have this here as a reference. So one of the things that people explore in the modern LLM era, and of course previously also, is using some sort of a rule-based evaluation, wherein the idea here is that you verify the LLM response using some sort of automatable constraints or rules. So you get a response from the LLM, and then you have some sort of a constraint checker, which checks whether a certain constraint has been met or not. And this is especially useful for benchmarks that test for formatting or instruction following, etc. And one of the examples for here is, let's say you're checking, you have an instruction that says that, okay, let letter N come so many number of times. And it's very easier for you to check automatically and deterministically whether that particular property was followed or not. And as you can imagine, you can use this sort of method for checking various different instruction following capabilities in LLMs. And the more juicier part, LLM as a judge. The idea here is again simple. You get a response from some LLM that you're looking to evaluate, and then you use a much powerful LLM. Let's say, that's why I've mentioned it as LLM++ to judge whether that response was correct or not. There are a bunch of different paradigms that people have explored in the literature. Again, you can have single answer scoring, pairwise evaluation, reference grounded evaluation, different strategies, vanilla, rubrics, axis, etc. I'm not going to go into too much detail here again. And different types of evaluators. You can either zero shot, get your score in a zero shot fashion, or you can have specialized fine-tuned LLMs whose only responsibility is to act as an evaluator. Some interesting findings now. First basic question, are LLMs good multilingual evaluators? Of course, to some extent, yes. And if you observe the blue lines, let's say the blue plots, for the high resource languages, they are quite well correlated with human judgments. But as the resource of the language reduces, the correlation also reduces. So the idea here is that GPT and such, judged models, they agree quite well with humans in the high resource languages, not so much in the low resource languages. Of course, these results are a bit outdated. These were for the GPT-4 model. Now, of course, GPT-5 and other models have come up, which may perform a bit better than this. Second finding is, does this vary with task type? Yes. Summarization, for example, has much better correlation as compared to a much open-ended task like open prompt or continue writing. So they deviate most from humans in open-ended creative tasks. Third question, which paradigm is more reliable? We had seen 3 paradigms there. I'm just showing results for 2 of them here. We see that pairwise comparison is much better than direct comparison, and that's kind of obvious because it's easier to evaluate, compare 2 responses and choose which one is better rather than from scratch, scoring one of them. That was for zero-shot models. There are also works that have fine-tuned LLM judges, and this is one of the examples, one of the more prominent models called as Prometheus. And the idea here is that you want a fine-tuned model whose only responsibility is to judge a certain response. And the way you train it is that you create your prompt, which has an multilingual instruction, which is your prompt. You've got some sort of a scoring rubric. Rubric is something like when to give what score. You've got your multilingual response, And optionally, you have some sort of multilingual reference. And you train the model on lots of examples, and the response that the model gives is some sort of a feedback as well as a judgment on how good that particular response was. And the kind of data that you train it on, you should have some sort of, some combination of English data, some multilingual data, as well as, interestingly, some sort of translation evaluation data, so that, as you've seen in the previous sections, adding translation and parallel data helps in better alignment, and that's the similar logic here. Now, how good is fine-tuning as compared to zero shot? If you look at the highlighted rows, the M Prometheus rows, they do perform better than their zero shot alternatives, but they still lag a bit as compared to GPT-4o. Of course, slightly outdated results, the performance may improve with GPT-5. And what are the different strategies? How do different strategies affect here? First important observation is that the choice of base model that you're fine-tuning on has larger impact. For example, Quen is maybe a better multilingual model as compared to others, and hence it performs much better than all the other alternatives. And also adding empty evaluation data helps, and that's what I had shown you previously. And the third thing is, along with translation, training on synthetic multilingual data is better than machine translated data. And by synthetic multilingual data, I mean literally asking your larger models to generate in that particular language rather than translating them. This is another variant of an LLM as a judge, a fine-tuned LLM as a judge approach, wherein there are certain works that have shown that evaluating with a reference answer is better as compared to evaluating without a reference answer. But getting certain references in other languages is quite difficult. You either need humans to write those references, or you need some sort of material that is present online. But getting those things is quite difficult. So what if the reference remains in English? And as you can see in this diagram, the prompt and the response is in Telugu, but the reference answer is in English, and the model is able to successfully evaluate against it. And it is, of course, better than zero-shot GPT-4o. I won't go into too many details here. And it also generalizes well to other unseen languages. So for example, if you train your model on Bengali, it can potentially evaluate other languages also. And it's also better than even having references in your native language. As you can see, this French, having references in English is better than having references in the native language itself. Great. So now let's look at the final thing, evals in the wild. One disadvantage of all the existing benchmark-based approaches is that they are static, they are prone to contamination. People can voluntarily or involuntarily introduce them in the training data itself. And also they fail to capture all the nuances that are possible in real world. That's why you need some sort of live evaluation platforms. One of the examples is the chatbot arena. And that's the most natural and real world evaluation that's possible. And there's no scope of contamination. And since it's actually completely driven by humans, that captures the utility more as compared to the benchmarks. There are a bunch of ranking systems, which for the sake of time, I'm going to skip for now. These all will be there in the reference materials. You can have a look at them. And another alternative is having something like leaderboards. LM Arena was an online leaderboard. You can construct similar offline leaderboards, wherein you've got some prompts and responses. You get a bunch of human annotators to rate which response is better or not, and then you can compute your leaderboards. That's the main core of the evaluation part. How are we doing with time? Okay, sure. So then let's look at one important thing, and I'll probably end with this. That's the cultural evaluation. With multilingual scenarios, you would want your model to be culturally aware, because when you get a response in a certain language, you would want certain cultural elements to come out that will simply increase the user experience. So there are a bunch of things that you want to evaluate in culture. For example, you need to check for cultural values, you need to check for religion or philosophy, safety, reasoning, social norms, all these other things. And another list of broad domains that one needs to evaluate in cultural benchmarks. And how to create these cultural benchmarks, I'll again quickly go over all of these things. One approach is, of course, human-driven creation, wherein you hire a bunch of people or you get a group of people together, ask them to write questions for your particular culture, then you just evaluate a bunch of models. Second approach is something called LLM, human cultural teaming. The idea here is that you get humans to interact with the models. They notice certain behaviors, let the model also write some questions. Humans see how good those questions are, and then choose those questions which, for which models don't perform well, slightly penalizing the models, but it's fine. And that's how human LLM collaboration can create better questions. And finally, evaluating cultural safety. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the idea here is that one way doesn't work for all, because there are a bunch of different identity groups in different different cultures care about different identity groups, different cultures care about different domains, and hence one way doesn't work for all. It's better to always have your specific safety like evaluations for your culture. And to quickly summarize, for quick experiments, translating existing benchmarks is the good option, and ensure appropriate human involvement in different stages of the benchmark creation process. Exercise caution and always verify whether LLM as a judge is working well for your language or not. And also ensure that you always holistically evaluate for cultural competency, fairness, and safety for your respective scenarios. That's the end of the main part of the tutorial. We'll end with some short summary and some future directions for you all to go along with. Anoop, are you there? We have about two to 3 minutes. If you can quickly wrap up that.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay. So as we come to the end of the tutorial, let's kind of summarize the findings and then look at what opportunities in terms of research questions exist so that we can further push uh, improvement of multilingual LLMs by expanding existing LLMs. So to summarize, it is very clear that multilingual LLMs are a very important direction to democratize LLMs to uh, discover new use cases. And the central challenges that we face are in terms of uh, data imbalance and how do we do better cross-lingual alignment. There is the issue of cost of supporting new languages also. And so, as far as cost is concerned, what we discussed today was extending strong English dominant LLMs to other languages is an effective and efficient direction. And uh, as we have seen throughout the tutorial, there is a good body of work covering various aspects of language expansion, like vocab expansion, CPT, IFT, etc., which provide a lot of insight and best practices. As far as data is concerned, there are many data curation efforts and documented pipelines to create high quality data. That those are good starting points for further creation of datasets as well. While this is where we stand today, what are interesting challenges and open problems? So, from the point of view of improving the adaptation pipeline, the general workflow that we talked about, a lot of the methods we talked about have given us a lot of insights, a lot of findings. But then the next obvious step would be, can we put these insights into robust recipes which work end to end and help us improve uh, the extend English LLMs to new languages? There are some efforts like Sailor 2 which have come up with such pipelines, and we need more of the same. Uh, so efficiency is, of course, a prime concern in this work. And how do we look for better efficiency in language adaptation at different stages? Things like model merging look very potentially interesting. At the same time, how do we preserve capabilities and avoid catastrophic forgetting? The central question, of course, is questions related to multilingual learning. So, how do we do multilingual knowledge transfer effectively? That remains an evergreen challenge, as we have spoken throughout the tutorial. And there are these nascent areas of reasoning and preference alignment, which are in terms of multilingual uh, reasoning and preference alignment relatively underexplored, and there's a lot of progress to be made in those areas. Uh, Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of data curation, so again, a lot of work has happened on data curation, but we sort of signaled that there is data to be unlocked from different sources beyond web text, so multilingual data sources, as well as data sources which are very localized and difficult to find on the web, but can be discovered through communities, local communities, and interaction with them. These are things to look for. Uh, Today, in training modern LLMs, synthetic data plays a very important role in terms of it, uh, having the kind of right data mix that we are looking for the kind of capabilities we want to inject into LLMs. But now, when it comes to multilingual LLMs, we want to look at how we can improve synthetic data creation, given that multilingual LLMs are weak. So, how can we look at directions like that? One way of creating data is machine translation, and how do we do high quality document level machine translation at scale, so that we can create data that's, for multiple languages is another interesting direction to continue to work on. Evaluation, of course, remains a very important area. So how do we unlock the uh, how do we build multilingual benchmarks that can assess different LLM capabilities? This is the continuing investment by different groups, different teams, but all this together will help us build good benchmarks, which kind of reflect cultural nuances, regional and language relevant use cases. Of course, we want very scalable evaluation methods. So the research and the effort to come up with better methods, especially using LLM judges, is again like another interesting direction that we may want to look for. Uh, so next slide, please. Yeah. So that was what we had today for this tutorial. Hope that with this tutorial, you would have a uh, overview of this entire rich area and important area of how can we adapt LLMs to new languages. And the tutorial material will be shared on the link given here shortly. Uh, and if there is anything you want to reach out to us, please feel free to reach out with any queries. And
Yeah, so thank you everyone. And I think because we are short of time, we'll take questions offline. And thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for bearing with us. And we apologize for shooting a little bit in terms of time. But yeah, we'll be available here in case you have any questions.